हेलो आ रहा है, इसमें आ रहा है ऑडियो. Start. Okay. A very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to this open session on economic survey being conducted by Vision IAS in the interest of all the aspirants, all the people who are giving the exam this year, who have already given the exam this year, want to prepare for their interviews, or for anybody else who just want to get a hang of what this economic survey document is, what does it entail, and what can you learn from it. I welcome you all on behalf of Vision IAS. My name is Aditya. I'll be taking up some portion of this economic survey session. Remaining portion will be taken up by other faculties. I'll be there with you in today's session and tomorrow's session, and I'll be taking up 4 chapters with you. Let's start a discussion on economic survey. Few things that I have been asked to communicate to everybody who is watching. Number 1, there will be a summary document that will be shortly uploaded. You will get the link for the document in the description section of the video. The document of summary is uploaded on our website in the resources section. It has not yet been uploaded, but it will soon be uploaded. So kindly wait for it. Kindly wait for it. Number 1. Number 2, I'll be using some slides today to conduct this session. These slides are for my reference. You will get these slides, but not today. You will get these slides after tomorrow's session. कल जब session हो जाएगा, when I am done with my part of the session, then these slides would be uploaded, not today. Today I'd request you all to please follow the session along with the slides that I'll be using here with me, rather than writing about when will the slides be uploaded, when will the summary be uploaded. I've given you these two important pieces of information in the beginning itself. Our endeavor would be to complete this session within 2 hours. We know that beyond 2 hours it's a bit difficult for all of you to stay in front of your screens. So that would be our endeavor. Let's see how far we are able to meet that promise. I expect that we should be able to finish it in within 2 hours. Let's start without any further delay. Let's start a discussion on this year's economic survey. A brief introduction about the document. Economic survey is a document that details economic policies made by the government in previous years and analyzes them to some extent. It tells us information about what all steps did the government take, and more importantly, why did the government take certain steps. In past few years, economic survey document also used to contain the strategy that the chief economic advisor had in his or her mind. It has been his because all the chief economic advisors in past 10 years have been his. Anyways, so economic survey also used to have some information about some of the thoughts of the chief economic advisor as well, as in what would he like the government to do, what steps can the government take. So in that sense, economic survey also had some sort of policy speculations. I'll use the word policy speculation as in it was the speculation of the mind of economic survey, and therefore he used to present us with some of the thoughts that he would be having or his team would be having and would want the government to pursue. This year's economic survey to a large extent restrains from this. I say restrains to a large extent, not completely. This year's economic survey is more on the lines of traditional economic surveys which we used to have earlier, as in it is more focused upon the government's policy last year and explaining why did we pursue that policy and what have been the results of that policy. So it is more about the what, the why, and then what has happened. What was there, why did something happen, why did something take place, and then what has happened as a result of what you did. So this economic survey is more on those lines. Certainly yes, the principal economic advisor who has authored this year's economic survey, he also gives about his thoughts about what more can be done. He suggests certain policy reforms, supply side reforms as in infrastructure reform, reforms pertaining to social sector. He suggests those reforms, certainly yes, but largely the document is about that. To a large extent it is about that. In this year's document, we will find, as I said, first a description of situation that we were in or we are in right now. What were the policy responses that we had on our table? Which policy response did we choose and why? And what has been the consequence of that choice? We are in a middle of once in a century pandemic. In 2020, the pandemic struck, the government had some policies with it, policy actions available with it, it took some actions. In 2021, it continued to take those actions based on feedback, based on continuous updation. A new set of policy measures were taken, some old were continued. What has been the impact of those policy measures on our various macroeconomic indicators? This is what this year's economic survey talks about. We'll discuss about these things in detail as according to economic survey for next 2 hours. So let's start a discussion without any further delay. Now let's delve deep into what is our economic survey telling us. This session, let me please be very clear in the beginning. This session, the nature of this session is tuned towards civil services aspirants. There would be many people who will be watching this session just to get to know about what is economic survey talking about. I welcome them as well, but let me tell everybody, this session is more tuned towards civil services aspirant. That is what we do. I'll be explaining some things which are there in economic survey. I'll explain some basics associated with some terms. I will give examples of questions that have been asked in previous years civil services examination, both prelims and mains, and will also let you know, sometimes I'll interject the presentation of economic survey with discussion on certain questions which we have formulated for you. All these questions that we'll be discussing would be there in my slides. There are additional set of questions which will be made available to you when the summary document is uploaded. As I said, the summary document will be uploaded in some time, if not today, then tomorrow, or in the coming few sessions, it will be uploaded. It is a detailed summary document that consists of the summary of the survey as well as some questions pertaining to different parts. Many students have this question that should we read this entire document? 400 पेज का डॉक्यूमेंट है, 400-450 पेज का डॉक्यूमेंट है, अब पूरा पढ़े कि नहीं पढ़े? इसके सिवा एक एनेक्स भी है. Usually there are volume 1 and volume 2. This time we don't have two volumes, volume 1, volume 2. This time we have just one volume which is quite bulky in itself, and second volume is a statistical appendix. तो पूरा पढ़ना है कि नहीं पढ़ना है, कई लोगों के मन में सबसे पहला सवाल यही होता है. तो उसका आंसर सीधा सी बात है, यस, हाँ पूरा पढ़ना है. You should read, you should try to read. Why not? You should try to read economic survey because when you read it, you get to be in the mind of policymaker. We have been reading newspapers during our preparation days. When we read newspapers are largely critical of the government. In newspaper, somebody will write an article criticizing this policy, that policy, that this must have been done, this must have been done. A newspaper writer, as in some economic policy commentator, that person is not the decision maker. With all due respect to the person who is writing columns in newspaper, that person has good intentions in mind, is probably a good academic, would be a good academic, as in has good academic credentials to his or her backing. But when they write something, it is from the point of view of an outsider. When principal economic advisor or chief economic advisor write an economic survey, it is from the point of view of an insider, that is the government. What challenges did the government have in front of it? We can always say that government should do more, it should spend more in this, it should spend more in that, it should spend more in something else. Everybody, according to their own vested interest or their own academic inclinations, would ask the government to spend in one or more other area. As the government, as the decision maker, it is your responsibility that you have got to take care of multiple objectives simultaneously. Which means that if you pursue one, probably your ability to pursue something else reduces. All the objectives that you would like to meet that somebody else is suggesting are noble objectives. Your ability to pursue one will probably be compromised if you try to meet another objective with more vigor. So that is why reading and understanding economic survey is important, because you get to know what is going on in the mind of policymaker. Sincerely hope most of you are already aspiring to be a civil servant. If not civil servant, then something else in the government services. You should get to know how does the government think, how does the government respond, how does government take decisions. That is why reading and understanding of this document is required. It is not required because you want to remember certain features of some schemes. It is not required because you want to know what is the trend in, let's say, fiscal deficit. What are the properties of various government schemes. सरकार ने एक स्कीम लॉन्च करी, प्रधानमंत्री गरीब कल्याण योजना, प्रधानमंत्री गरीब अन्न योजना. तो गरीब अन्न योजना क्या है, वो पढ़ने के लिए इकोनॉमिक सर्वे नहीं पढ़ना. You don't have to read economic survey to understand what is there in this in that गरीब अन्न योजना. You have to understand, you have to read economic survey to understand what is going on in the mind of government, that it is taking a certain policy step. With this perspective, you should be reading the government document. I hope I've made myself absolutely clear to you. Let's start our discussion. Let's start. The chapters that I'll be taking up with you, today I'll take up the first two chapters of survey, the state of economy and fiscal developments. Today I'll take up these two chapters. In tomorrow's session, I'll be taking up the chapter of monetary management and prices and inflation. The first chapter, state of economy, this chapter is like an overall summary of economic survey. State of economy, the first chapter is like an overall summary of economic survey. It talks about various macroeconomic indicators. Certainly in the specific chapters related to these economic indicators, there would be more details. In the first chapter, we get to know about prices, inflation, fiscal developments, external sector. We get to know about all these things. But there are certain dedicated chapters to all these things in which you will find greater details about more policy measures, why did government take certain steps, what has been the progress and what is the outlook, what more can be done. So this is like a summary document, this is like a summary of entire economic survey, and these three chapters we will do today, which talk about this chapter, fiscal policy, fiscal developments. We will do this chapter today, which talks in detail about fiscal position of the government. Let's start. Our economic survey begins with an assessment of government policy. Government policy as in response of the government to COVID pandemic. It compares response of India to rest of the world. In normal times, economic survey says that our policy is usually based on complete assessment of the situation and then trying to take steps in order to manage that situation to our betterment, to our advantage. There is something that exists, economy की अभी कुछ present state है, there is some present state of the economy. You are able to assess it completely, and once you assess it, you are able to decide beforehand that this is what you will do. Normally, when you go ahead with such a situation, with such a policy response, there is some sort of feedback mechanism as well, and you try to incorporate that feedback in your policy response. But largely what happens is, largely when you take a decision, it is the decision has been taken based on your initial assessment and the major steps have already been taken. Assessment has been done and major steps have been taken. This is what is normally called as the waterfall model. इसको हम बोलते हैं waterfall model. In COVID, this waterfall model is not so applicable because it is not so resilient. In COVID, the strategy that has been followed is, and we'll talk about that strategy after we talk about some basic macroeconomic indicators in a while. We'll talk about that strategy. The strategy that government of India policy makers chose to adopt was the agile framework or the barbell strategy. We'll talk in detail about this particular strategy or this framework under which this strategy was taken, agile framework or this barbell strategy. We'll talk about it. This policy is basically based on continuous feedback, a continuously updating policy, rather than broad steps which have already been taken and you update in small iterations based on some regular feedbacks. Rather than that, you give more importance to feedbacks. You give more importance to some high frequency indicators from which you continuously assess that, okay, this is what needs to be done. So your policy is continuously varying. This is what agile framework is. Again, this is at a very broad level that I have explained to you. We'll discuss in detail what exactly this agile framework and barbell strategy is. Before we go into this agile framework and barbell strategy of Government of India, let's first have a quick look at various macroeconomic indicators. These macroeconomic indicators, certainly much important information can be had from these indicators from our prelims perspective. Let's quickly have a look at those indicators under our discussion on state of economy. So what exactly is our state of economy? If we look at the situation is that of a continuously mutating virus. Last year when I did this economic survey session, it was again around this time only in the month of February, mid-February. Till that time the second wave had not struck. Economic survey had wrote down that hopefully we have been able to tide over this COVID pandemic with relatively less economic costs, with relatively less health costs. As destiny was to strike, in the month of April, May, June, the second wave, which had much harsher health costs, struck the economy, rest of the world as well. The economic costs were quite less as compared to the first wave, but the health costs were quite big. After the second wave, again we started to come to normalcy during the months of July and afterwards, but then again during the months of January, late December and January, the third wave again struck, again causing a disruption in economic activity. Hopefully this time the economic costs as well as health costs would be less, but nobody can predict what is going to happen in future. So point is, we live in uncertain times with respect to a mutating virus. Second description of the situation that we live in is that we are living in a world in which there is a continuous disruption of global supply chains. Global supply chains being disrupted continuously. You see, for example, that there is high freight costs as in to transport goods from one place to another. Supply chains are being disrupted every now and then. Any country goes into a lockdown and therefore an entire supply chain gets disrupted. A very good example being the microchip industry, which has caused the slowdown in so many associated industries. So microchip, we get to know about microchip because there is shortage in passenger vehicle sales. Maruti अपनी गाड़ियां नहीं बेच पा रही है, इसीलिए हमें microchip की shortage के बारे में पता है. But microchips are not just used in cars. In fact, we got to know that they were used in cars only during this pandemic. There are so many industries, around 150 industries that are directly or indirectly reliant upon this microchip industry. So there is a continuous disruption of global supply chains. One item we aren't able to import from other, we cannot produce a final product. Another example of disruption of global supply chain is in form of rising prices of edible oil. Mustard oil costs about 200 rupees per liter. सरसों का तेल 200 रुपए पर लीटर हो चुका है. अब 200 रुपए पर लीटर क्यों हुआ है सरसों का तेल? It is not as if सब लोग सरसों का तेल पीने लगे. Everybody has started to drink mustard oil. Mustard oil's price has increased drastically again thanks to multiple, not just one factor, obviously not just one factor, but thanks to multiple factors again which can be pinned down to disruption of global supply chain. Strikes in palm oil plantations in the countries from where we import, inability to import because of geopolitical reasons, etc. Multiple factors causing global supply chains being disrupted. Second feature of the world that we are in right now, uncertainty. Uncertainty persists with respect to monetary policy as well. Because of COVID and continuing from the global financial crisis of 2008, central bank in rest of the world, especially in the advanced economies, they were printing money and they were pushing money like anything in the economy. Now there is return of inflation in most of advanced economies as well as emerging market economies. Inflation in various economies can be attributed to various reasons, not just printing of more money, not just increased demand, disruption of supply chain. There are many factors which are causing return to inflation, increase in inflation in many countries. So inflationary times along with a likely withdrawal of easy monetary policy, again that is causing uncertainty in present time. So that is the description of the situation that we are living in right now. Let's see how have our macroeconomic indicators been in the past year. State of the economy. The first thing to note is that we are back at the pre-pandemic level of economy. I hope everybody can see this graph on their screens. The growth of our economy in the year 2021-22 is expected to be around 9%. And because of that, it is expected that we will cross the pre-pandemic level of economy this year itself. If, for example, value of something is 100 and it falls down to 50, we say that there is a 50% loss in value. 100 थी 100 से 50 हो गई कोई चीज, so that means there is a 50% loss in value. Now for it to recover back to 100, अब 50 है और वापस से पुराने लेवल 100 पे पहुंचना है. Right now it's 50 and it has to get back to the old value of 100. By what percentage should it rise? It should rise by 100% so that it becomes equal to 100. 100 से 50 हुआ मतलब 50% decline, 50% fall. 50% fall over 100 rupees is now you are at 50. To go back to 100 from present value you have to increase by 100%. 50 से 100 होना मतलब 50 के ऊपर 100 होना. That means an increase to 100 means an increase of 100% over 50. So keep this in mind when you are studying, when you are analyzing India's GDP. Our GDP decreased from some number to another number. From 100 units, it declined by about 7 percentage points in the year 2020. सन 2019 में, in the year 2019-20, let's say the value of our GDP was 100. In the year 2020, it declined by about 7.5%. तो 100 से कम हो गई 92.5. From 100, it decreased to 92.5. From 92.5 to get back to 100, अब वापस 100 पहुंचना है. That means an increase of 7.5 units over 93.5. 7.5 upon 93.5, somewhere around 9%. Our economy is expected to grow this year at a rate of more than 9%, and therefore we expect that this year we will be back at the pre-pandemic level of output, both in GDP terms as well as GVA terms. In GDP terms as well as GVA terms, we are expected to be back at the pre-pandemic level of output. Pre-pandemic level of output both in GDP and GVA term begs the question, the difference between GDP and GVA. मालूम होना चाहिए सबको क्या होती है GDP, क्या होता है GVA. GDP, gross domestic product, the final value of goods and services produced in the economy. When we talk about GDP, अगर हम केवल GDP रेफर करते हैं, when we talk about only the word GDP, we are referring to calculating GDP at market prices. We calculate GDP at market prices unless otherwise specified. Market prices. GVA means you are calculating GVA at basic prices. Basic price matlab price at the factory gate. Basically meaning that what you do is in GVA you add indirect taxes and subtract subsidies to arrive at GDP. GDP is equals to GVA plus indirect taxes minus subsidies. GDP is equals to GVA plus indirect taxes minus subsidies. Taxes and subsidies are a result of government interventions in the market. GVA, value added, is the result of what is being produced by the producers in the economy. Producers कितना produce कर रहे हैं? The value of output produced by producers is GVA. There is a difference between what producers are producing, the value of output that producers are producing, versus what consumers are paying. Consumers pay price which is inclusive of tax and exclusive of subsidy. अगर मैं कुछ चीज खरीदता हूं, if I purchase sugar mill produces it at 50 rupees per kg, गवर्नमेंट ने उसके ऊपर टैक्स लगाया 10 रुपए का, बन गए 60 रुपए की शुगर. उसके ऊपर सरकार ने सब्सिडी दी 5 रुपए की, रह गई 55 रुपए की शुगर. Government levies a tax of 10 rupees, 50 becomes 60. Government gives a subsidy of 5 rupees, 50 becomes 55, 60 becomes 55. So 55 is the price that I pay, 55 is the GDP, 50 is the price that factory gets, that is GVA. So this is the difference between GDP and GVA. Everybody must know this, very important from our prelims point of view. Question this year in the exam, इस साल 2 सवाल पूछे गए एग्जाम में. In the year 2021 mains, 2 questions in mains this year. One question, what has been the change in GDP estimation in the year 2015? Question with respect to this has been asked. Second question that has been asked is, do you agree that Indian economy has recently experienced a V-shaped recovery? Give reasons in support of your answer. Do you agree? ये इस साल का सवाल है मेंस का. इस साल मेंस का सवाल. Do you agree that Indian economy has recently experienced a V-shaped recovery? Give reasons in support of your answer. Question that UPSC will ask will always have this, reasons in support of your answer. To give reasons, you must be able to draw something like this in your exam. You must be able to tell that yes, Indian economy has undergone a V-shaped recovery or not undergone a V-shaped recovery. जैसे ये है, this is our shape of recovery. Look something like a W shape, something like a twisted W. एक leg बड़ा है, एक leg छोटा W का. Some people say K-shaped recovery, some people say V-shaped recovery. This is where you get that information from. So make sure you are looking at these diagrams, these charts, these trends in your economic survey carefully. So Indian economy back to the pre-pandemic level of output, undergoing almost a V-shaped recovery, or to be more precise, somewhat like a twisted W-shaped recovery. It fell down sharply in first quarter of 2020-21. It regained its pace quickly, fell down a little bit again during the second wave, and is regaining its pace again. Overall, this is the level of output. Overall, this was the level of output in the year 2019. Right now, we are a little bit above that level in GDP terms as well as GVA terms. This was the level of GVA in 2019. This is the level of GVA in 2021. 2020 mein obviously both are less because we contracted by about 7.5% in that year. So this is about that. I hope it makes sense and is clear to everybody. So the first state of economic thing that we have discussed is, the first aspect that we have discussed is size of economy in terms of GDP. We can look at GDP in 2 ways. One, we can look at GDP from the production side, and second, we can look at GDP from the demand side. Production side, we look at GDP based on what are the various sectors that are producing some output: agriculture sector, industrial sector, and services sector. If we look at sectoral composition of GDP, important thing to note, again prelims में ये सब सवाल पूछे जा सकते हैं. They can ask these questions in prelims. Sectoral composition of GDP, you should know agriculture and allied sector, this sector did not slow down during the pandemic as in the year 2020 and 2021. In both years, agriculture sector has shown a growth. तो agriculture तो obviously क्योंकि grow कर रहा है, positive rate पे grow रहा है, 3.6% last year, 3.9% this year. So obviously agriculture is in a positive state as compared to 2019. Industry on the other hand, industry and services, they have witnessed a reversal. Industry contracted by about 7% last year and has grown by about 11.8% this year. Overall, industry is about 4% more than where it was in 2019. 2019 के comparison में industry is a little bit more. Services on the other hand contracted by about 8.4% last year, have grown by about 8.2% this year. Last year ज़्यादा contract किए थे, इस साल कम grow किए हैं. That is why services are not yet at the level at which they were in 2019. Services are still less than their previous level of 2019, that is before pandemic. Within services, it's quite expected कि services के अंदर growth नहीं होगी because services are, there are many sector services that are contact based services. Most importantly, hotels, tourism, transportation, gyms, entertainment, many contact based services, they have failed to recover. Other services, for example, banking, financial intermediation, IT services, these services have been able to recover. So if we look at subgroups, subgroups of industry, subgroups of services, different subgroups show a different level of growth and hence a different rate of recovery. In the contact intensive services, there has been less growth. For example, trade, hotels, transportation, communication, etc. We are only at about 91% level of where we were in 2019. That means there is still a substantial amount to grow further. Whereas in other aspects of services, we are at a little bit more. Overall, if we combine agriculture, industry and services, we are now more than GDP in 2021 is more than what it was in 2019. This translates into changing share of three different sectors. Agriculture, whose share was declining, largely share of agriculture has been on the declining trend in our overall output. Share of services has been on the increasing trend in overall output. If we go back to about past 30 years, share of agriculture has drastically come down, whereas share of services has continuously moved up. From about 40%, services now had a share of about almost 60% in the year 2015, about in the year around 2014-15. Because of robust growth in agriculture in past few years and in industry, share of services has come down a little bit and agriculture industry has increased a little bit as compared to earlier. Because of COVID, because services have not grown to their earlier level and agriculture has continued to grow, because of that share of agriculture has increased. Question prelims में इसी type से पूछा जाएगा that share of agriculture has continuously been decreasing as a proportion of economy. ये सवाल पूछा जाएगा एग्जाम में. Share of services has continuously been increasing as a proportion of economy. So if you don't know the details, then probably you will mark the answer wrong. Services का share in general has been on the increasing trend, but because of COVID, services have suffered more and therefore services have faced a contraction. Because of that, share of services in overall economy has come down, share of agriculture and industry has gone up a little bit. Agriculture ka share has gone up from about 18%, 18.4 to about 18.8%. Industry's share has gone up from about 26.7 to about 28.2. Services share has come down from about 55 to 53%. In mains, there might be a question that may be asked. In mains, they can ask a question about what is the reason for resilience of agriculture even during pandemic. They can ask a question, again frame it in a different manner. What is the reason that agriculture has performed better as compared to industry and services? Or what is the reason that services has failed to pick up? Despite being the engine of growth, services has failed to pick up in the post-COVID world, in the post-COVID Indian economic recovery. They can ask questions like this in your exam. So why has agriculture done well? Agriculture has done well because number one, it was relatively less impacted by COVID, relatively less contact intensive. More importantly, there was more labor, more output, more procurement by government, more timely distribution of various inputs such as seeds and fertilizer to agriculture sector. An increasing allocation towards agriculture, budgetary allocation towards agriculture has ensured that agriculture sector grows. Therefore, agriculture has grown. Whereas services, industry, too many contact intensive parts there. Industry is also dependent upon services to large extent. If there is a lockdown, therefore industry's ability to transport things will also reduce. Hence, industry also depends upon the services sector. There has been resilience in industry, as in industry has also grown, but not as much as in it has grown. Government has given various incentives, but at the same time, we would like industry to have grown at a faster pace. Services has grown, has been able to almost recover to its pre-pandemic level, but still because of it being largely contact intensive, it is still lagging a little bit. If we look at specific components of services, yes, many have grown past their pre-pandemic level, some parts have not yet grown. Important aspect with respect to sectoral composition. Second, if we look at economy from the demand side, There are a few questions that I have for you. I have got a few questions as well for you. Before we move on to looking at economy from the demand side, I've got few questions. For example, in your economic survey, you will find multiple charts associated with such as area sown under Rabi crops and Kharif crops, total production of wheat and paddy. So you may get these questions in prelims. Prelims में ऐसे सवाल बहुत common होते हैं. Very common questions of this form in prelims. For example, they may ask a question that paddy production is less than wheat production. चावल का production गेहूं के production से कम है. Paddy is less than wheat. Total production of paddy is less than wheat. Answer would obviously be no. Paddy production has almost always been higher than total wheat production. Production of rice has been more than production. I think last year they asked this question that which of the following countries is largest exporter of rice? So they may ask a question about comparison of production of paddy and wheat. Similarly, they can ask you comparison about total area sown under Rabi crops and Kharif crops. Under Kharif crop, the total area sown is almost double than which is sown in Rabi crop. Kharif में जितना area the area sown under Kharif crop is almost double the area that is sown in Rabi crop. This is something that is important for you to note. They can ask a question with respect to, as we were discussing, various sub-components or sub-sectors of industry, services. इससे सवाल पूछा सकता है. Arrange the following in their increasing contribution to total industrial sector. Arrange the following in their total contribution to their services sector. So they may ask questions like this. So यहाँ पे I have got this table. In industry, the largest, एक चीज तो याद कर ही सकते हो, that within industry the largest contribution is that of manufacturing and second largest is that of construction. ये चीज तो याद करनी चाहिए आपको. This is something that you should remember. If you look at industrial sector, the largest contribution is that of manufacturing, second is of construction. उसके बाद mining and then electricity gas. Mining and quarrying and electricity gas, they are usually mining and quarrying and electricity gas, they usually change places. Okay, so they may ask a question like this as well in the exam. So these are few questions with respect to this particular part, as in composition of our economy from the production side, GDP, by looking at it from the output side. Now let's have a look at GDP from the demand side. In your NCERT chapter 1, National Income Accounting, clearly it is written, clearly it is given to you. I urge all of you to read that chapter closely. You can calculate GDP in three ways: income approach, expenditure approach and production approach. You can look at your GDP in three ways. GDP being comprised of various sections who are demanding certain goods. GDP can also be looked at various sections that are earning some income. GDP can also be looked at various producers that are producing some good. Production method, income method and expenditure method. So your expenditure method is nothing but your demand side approach to viewing GDP. Demand. In your economy, demand comes from various sectors. Usually we see demand in the economy coming from four different sectors: households, government, firms and foreigners. Households demand a total consumption expenditure which we denote as C, capital C. Aggregate demand in the economy is referred to as, aggregate demand in the economy can be referred to as C plus G plus I plus X minus M, where C refers to total demand, consumption demand by households. G refers to total government expenditure or government demand. So this C plus G is your consumption. सरकार कितना कंज्यूम कर रही है मतलब कितना स्पेंड कर रही है, और हाउसहोल्ड्स कितना कंज्यूम कर रहे हैं मतलब कितना स्पेंड कर रहे हैं. C plus G refers to total consumption. I refers to total investment. Firms कितना स्पेंड कर रही हैं, how much are firms spending in total. Firms का expenditure क्या है, expenditure of firms is investment. How much are firms investing. X minus M is, X is your exports, that is how much are foreigners demanding. minus M is how much are domestic entities demanding from foreign sources, that is imports. So this is your total aggregate demand or GDP from the demand side. Demand side से GDP को जब हम देखते हैं, when we look at GDP from demand side, it is C plus G plus I plus X minus M. If you look at various components, if you look at these four components, that is consumption component, investment component, export and import component of GDP, if you look at them, then all components of GDP from demand side have returned to their pre-pandemic level except the private consumption or the household consumption. C, household consumption expenditure. C, that is private consumption. This is still below the pre-pandemic level. Household consumption is still below the pre-pandemic level. Government consumption is above that. Investment is above that. X, that is exports, are above that, and imports are also above the pre-pandemic level. So all consumptions of aggregate demand bearing household consumption, that is C, are above their pre-pandemic level. An analytical question can be framed from this. For example, they may ask with respect to, जैसे अभी हम इसी साल लास्ट ईयर अभी we looked at last year's question, shape of economic recovery being V shape. So they may ask a similar question with respect to most of the economic recovery that has been witnessed is because of rise in government expenditure rather than rise in household expenditure. If you look at demand side of the economy, demand is coming from households, government, firms and foreigners. Demand of households had not increased, whereas demand of government, firms and foreigners has increased, as in exports have increased. Therefore, the important question that may be asked is analytical type का सवाल, that comment upon the nature of economic recovery given the fact that consumption expenditure or household consumption is still below the pre-pandemic level. I'll repeat, comment upon the nature of economic recovery given that the household consumption is still below the pre-pandemic level. So इस type के सवाल, we get to right answer to these questions by looking at this information. Economic survey, now comes how to write good answers for this, how to write an analytical answer to this. Our economic survey does a beautiful job in relying upon multiple high frequency indicators, HFIs as they call them. What are these high frequency indicators? High frequency indicators means the data for which is available at a relatively higher frequency, relatively quickly, rather than waiting for some survey to take place, collate that data, extrapolate that data and then release that data officially. Rather than waiting for something to come to you in a matter of 1 year, 2 year time, you have got high frequency indicators. Some of them may be available in real time, some of them may be available with a very less lag. Economic survey looks at these high frequency indicators and comments upon what has been the development with respect to consumption. For example, it looks at index of industrial production with respect to consumer durables. Consumer durables index of industrial production, as in we are talking about production only of consumer durables. Consumer durables कौन खरीदता है? Consumers, obviously, households. The index of production of consumer durables has been increasing, so therefore as far as that is concerned, consumer or household demand is rising. Consumer confidence survey conducted by RBI shows a rising trend. Improved consumer sentiment is being reflected in RBI's consumption surveys. There is an increase in digital payment, and it also certainly says that because of increased vaccination, it is households that were reluctant to consume because of increased vaccination coverage. Therefore, it is expected that more consumption will take place in future. It also talks about, it also tries to address that whether a decrease in passenger vehicle sales is a sign of weakening of demand, and then it goes on to say that no, it's not, because a decline in passenger vehicle sales is more or because of supply side constraint rather than demand side constraint, as is reflected in the increased waiting time across all segment of passenger vehicles. So this is with respect to consumer expenditure. I hope you can incorporate this information to write good answers. Let's move on from this. This was with respect to consumption expenditure, that is C, and G, total expenditure. Let's look at the investment expenditure, C plus G plus I plus X minus M. Government expenditure we will talk about in detail in our next chapter. जो हमारा next chapter है fiscal developments का, वो पूरा government expenditure और revenue के ऊपर ही based है. So we will talk about G in that chapter. Let's talk about I, that is investment expenditure. Question asked in mains in 2020, 2020 का सवाल है मेंस में. सवाल है, explain the meaning of investment in an economy in terms of capital formation. Explain the meaning of investment in an economy in terms of capital formation. There in your, it's given in your NCERT the concept of gross fixed capital formation. And obviously, when you look at these graphs in your economic survey, then you will be able to understand better what is actually meant by this term GFCF, gross fixed capital formation. Capital formation basically means expenditure by firms when they buy capital goods. Firms purchase capital goods, they incur an expenditure in that. Machinery basically, tools and machinery that firms purchase. That is what investment expenditure of firms is. Firms purchase those capital goods, that is called as investment by firms. Largely it is GFCF, gross fixed capital formation. There are some other components of investment as well. For example, change in inventory, that is also component of investment. That is not वो GFCF नहीं, वो gross fixed capital formation नहीं है. Residential investment, that is not GFCF. Largely it relates to investment by firms on account of purchase of capital goods. Very important thing. Prelims में they have asked question with respect to investment, that which of the following is considered as investment from an economy's perspective. Investment in stock markets, investment in capital markets by individuals, such as I would invest in capital market, that is not considered as economic investment. Economy में investment उसी को consider करते हैं जब capital goods purchase किए जाते हैं and some other things. Largely economic investment consists of only when capital goods are purchased. That is what investment from the perspective of economy is. I hope it makes sense, it's clear to everybody. With respect to investment in the economy, this has been the trend. There has been an improvement in investment in the economy, as is seen in the total investment. In the total investment, most part of increase comes from government investment or capex, capital expenditure by the government. Government spends money, as in government invests money, capital expenditure of government, investment. Large increase in overall investment in the economy is because of government expenditure, not because of private investment. Like large part of consumption expenditure in the economy is on account of government expenditure rather than private expenditure. Similarly, large part of investment increase in the economy is because of government investment rather than private investment. Another important thing to note. But just like private consumption is coming back on track, as we discussed through various high frequency indicators, private investment can also be seen to coming back on track. This is what economic survey tells us. Private investment is coming back on track, as can be seen, for example, by looking at rise in private investments under implementation, increased profits of private companies which are expected, I'll repeat, increased profits of private companies which are expected to help them take investment decisions. If private companies see a rise in their profits, therefore they will be tempted to invest. There is an increase in profits, probably it is because goods are becoming expensive or you are able to sell more goods. Since you are able to sell more goods or there is a rise in price of the goods that you are selling, you would be tempted to invest. So a rise in profits of private companies is also an indicator of future investments to come in the economy. Right now, investments under implementation rising, profits of companies rising, so there is a positive expectation of about rise in investments in future. Similarly, It is also expected that because banks are better capitalized today, NPA ratios have decreased, both gross and net NPA ratios, therefore banks are in a better position to lend money to the firms. Again, a positive expectation with respect to rising investments in future. Further, RBI's industrial outlook survey, that also tells us about that there is a positive expectation about rising investment. Increased mobilization of risk capital. For example, from markets, there have been a record number of IPOs and capital has been raised from market. This year, as in the year 2021-22, the number of new offers, IPOs, initial public offering in the capital markets, the money raised has been more than that has ever been raised in any year in past. And if Life Insurance Corporation is going to come with its IPO in next few days, probably if it comes in this fiscal year, then it will again be very high. Already bina LIC ke IPO ke bhi, the amount of risk capital that has been mobilized already is quite high. So these are some of the observations with respect to investment. We'll talk about investments in detail in our chapter on in our external sector chapter as well. We'll talk about investments with respect to government expenditure in next chapter only, which I'll be taking up, that is fiscal developments. The next component from demand side is our exports and imports. Again, C, G, I, X and M. More detail about exports and imports, we'll be looking at them in our discussion on chapter on external sector. Special chapter external sector, uske andar hum detail mein dekhenge. What has been position of India's current account, capital account, balance of payments, which sectors are witnessing a rise in exports, witnessing a rise in imports. We look at all those things in detail in that chapter. For now, this is the summary that yes, our exports have been rising, our imports have also been rising. Trends important hai, please have a look at these trends. Trend kya kehte hain? Last year we had a current account surplus. काफी समय के बाद हमारा current account surplus था. Current account surplus meaning that we had a positive trade balance on our current account. Our merchandise, as far as our merchandise exports are concerned, our merchandise imports are always greater than exports. So therefore merchandise पे हमारा हमेशा deficit होता है. But current account consists of trade in goods as well as invisibles, which includes basically services, remittances, etc. Overall, on the current account last year, we had a surplus. This time, again, that was an exceptional situation because of contraction of both imports and exports. Imports contracted to a greater degree than exports, and therefore we had a surplus. This year we are returning to quote unquote the normal territory or the expected territory where we have a current account deficit. In our external sector chapter, we will talk in detail about what is the extent of current account deficit. To be brief, to be precise, just to give you a summary, current account deficit may be there, it is certainly there, but our inflows on capital account are more than substantial. We have a balance of payment surplus this year as well. Probably we are going to have a balance of payment surplus this year as well. As a result of greater inflows on capital account as compared to outflows on current account, again we have been able to build up our reserves. We are now the fourth largest reserve holder in the world. China, Japan, Switzerland and India, we are now the fourth largest reserve holder of the world, foreign exchange reserve holder of the world. So this is with respect to external sector, imports and exports. As I said, we'll have a look at these things in detail in the specific chapter on external sector. Now let us talk about in detail about the government response. अब हम government response के बारे में बात करते हैं. Let's talk about the response of government with respect to the pandemic. As I said in the beginning, that government is following something called as a barbell strategy. Barbell strategy. Barbell strategy. Agile response. Let's understand what is meant by this term barbell strategy or this agile response. This is what this barbell strategy is. स्क्रीन पे कंप्लीटली विजिबल है या फिर कट रहा है? स्क्रीन पे फुल स्क्रीन करने से क्रॉप तो नहीं हो रहा है? ठीक है, ओके. Let's discuss what this barbell strategy and this agile framework is. This term barbell strategy is used in finance world. Finance में हम कैसे यूज करते हैं? Finance मतलब basically stock markets and investments, वहां पे we use this term barbell strategy. So barbell rod. Gym में most of सबको पता होगा barbell rod. You have a rod and there are weights on two sides. This barbell strategy is a strategy which focuses on two extreme ends. I'll repeat. Barbell strategy is a strategy that focuses on two extreme ends. In financial world, in finance world, in investment world, what this barbell strategy is, this barbell strategy tells us that your investments, whenever you invest your money, your investment can, this is ऐसी कोई, this is not that होली ट्रेल ऑफ इन्वेस्टमेंट कि यही इसी इन्वेस्टमेंट स्ट्रैटेजी के से हमको काम करना है. नो, दिस नॉट सम होली ट्रेल, सम होली ग्रेल. दिस नॉट एनी होली ग्रेल, सम एनीथिंग व्हिच विल गिव यू डेफिनेट रिटर्न. This is one of the many strategies that are available. One of the many strategies that are available for investment. So what does this strategy tell us? This strategy says that while investing, we can invest in low risk instruments and high risk instruments. Low risk instruments will largely protect your capital, whatever you have invested. अगर उस पे कम risk है, if you have invested in low risk instruments, most of it will be used for protection. The return would be less. You have invested your money somewhere. On this money, you will generate less returns, but you will also lose less if at all you do. If you make returns would be less. If you lose, your losses would be limited. Therefore, largely you will be able to protect. So one leg of this strategy is about protection, being risk averse, or to ensure that risks are minimized. The other end of the strategy is extreme. Other end is that where you invest in riskier instruments. These riskier instruments generate high returns for you. Riskier instruments generate high returns so that you expect that you are able to get better from the market. You are protecting most of what you have invested, plus on some part, कुछ part के ऊपर आप experiment कर रहे हो, you are experimenting. You are trying to see that where their money can get you high returns. So ये barbell strategy होती है finance world में. We have used the term barbell strategy. कोई finance की strategy नहीं है. Government is not quote unquote investing money in some stock market where it is on one hand investing in riskier assets like cryptocurrency, and on second hand it is investing in safe assets like gold. There is no investment strategy of the government in finance. Simply the use of the term is there. केवल term को use किया है barbell strategy. In context of government policy, what is this barbell strategy? In context of government expenditure or government fiscal policy, this barbell strategy is that our policy response will be twofold. On one hand, we will try to protect the vulnerable. The first leg of this strategy is protection of capital, protection. We will try to protect the vulnerable. Make sure that there are adequate safety nets from which we are trying to protect the vulnerable. Vulnerable people as in those who are losing their jobs or those who have lost their jobs, vulnerable businesses, small MSME businesses, MSMEs which are not able to persevere because of this difficult pandemic situation. So one end of the strategy is safety nets. I hope this is clear. That is one end. Second end of the strategy is that you invest money or you spend money in such a manner that it leads to some sort of reforms in future. With continuous updating of your policy responses. ये तो हो गई policy आपने. This part of policy is that you are protecting the poor, you are protecting the vulnerable, protecting those protecting those businesses who are unable to cope up with this pandemic. That is the conservative or the protective part of protective leg of the strategy. This leg of the strategy or this aggressive leg of the strategy is where you are trying to develop a policy on the go. You develop some policy that, okay, we will invest in this. We will give incentive to this particular sector. We will build this particular expressway. We'll build this particular road. You are trying to invest money in this part and you are trying to continuously get some feedback and trying to evolve a new policy. You get to know, okay, this is a sector that needs support, so okay, we'll provide support to this sector. This is a sector that has had support in past, therefore it's time to withdraw, hence we can withdraw from this. So this is this aggressive part and this is this protective part. So this is the barbell strategy. This barbell strategy, जो ये वाला part है हमारा, aggressive वाला part है, this is essentially what comes under the agile framework. Agile framework क्या है? Agile framework is, please have a look here what agile framework is. Agile framework responds by assessing outcomes in short iterations and constantly adjusting them incrementally. This agile framework, it's quite an established framework in management. What you try to do is when the environment is uncertain, जब बहुत ज्यादा अनसर्टेनिटी हो एनवायरमेंट की, कल को क्या होगा, क्या दोबारा से लॉकडाउन लग जाएगा कल को, क्या कोई सेंट्रल बैंक, अमेरिकन फेडरल रिजर्व विल विड्रॉ इट्स मॉनेटरी स्टिमुलस कंप्लीटली, इज देयर गोइंग टू बी अ restriction in movement of cargo ships because there is COVID pandemic in some port city of China? Are freight rates going to increase exorbitantly? There is too much uncertainty that is there in the economy, and when there is too much uncertainty, you do not try to predict what is going to happen. जो waterfall model था, waterfall model सारी information जो आज है, based on that waterfall model will try to see what is going to happen in future, and based on some feedback they will try to update their responses. In agile framework, you are not trying to predict the future, you are saying that it is quite uncertain, times are uncertain, so right now we'll make some policy based on present situation. Based on present situation we'll make some policy. आज जो लग रहा है उसके बेसिस पे हम पॉलिसी बनाएंगे. Next, as we move forward we'll get new information, there is going to be some evolution, some changes. Based on these changes, iterative changes, based on these new changes, we will update our policy response continuously. कुछ नया चेंज आया, हमने अपना पॉलिसी रिस्पॉन्स कंटिन्यूसली चेंज किया. Let's say we have provided production linked incentive scheme to pharmaceutical industry, but at the same time we found out that China is not giving us active pharmaceutical ingredients. So what we'll do is we will expand this production linked incentive scheme to pharma, specifically to API manufacturers. तो जो लोग इंडिया में active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacture कर रहे हैं, let's provide the benefit of PLI scheme to these people. Let's provide people with health insurance cover so that they are able to access medicines. So these are the responses of policies being updated in a continuous manner, in a very dynamic manner, based on your continuous feedback from the economy. This is what this agile framework is. You take steps, you move forward, then you see what is happening, you again update your policy. You keep on updating the path based on continuous feedback. This is what agile framework is. This is where HFIs come into picture. HFI meaning high frequency indicators. Let's say there is a high frequency indicator called Google mobility. From that Google mobility, for example, you search on Google some place. आपको कहीं पे जाना है. For example, you want to go to a restaurant and you search that place on Google. Now you see on Google that वहां पे एक बार बना होता है and that says that this place is right now busier than usual. Than usual means usually at this point this place has 10 people, right now there are 20 people at this place, so it is busier than usual. So based on this you try to find out mobility. अब जब आपको mobility पता चलेगी, then you know that the supply side restrictions or movement restrictions are easing or people are more comfortable in moving out, hence your policy response would change accordingly. You have a high frequency indicator, based on that you are changing your policy response continuously. This is your agile framework. This agile framework is especially applicable in this end of your barbell strategy. I hope this is clear to everybody that what this barbell strategy is and what this agile framework is. This is what I have explained, barbell strategy. One leg, which is the more conservative leg or the safety net leg, and other leg which is the flexible high return leg. Stimulus to the economy वहां पे provide कर रहे हो आप, और protection to the economy आप यहाँ पे दे रहे हो. There are multiple macroeconomic indicators that are given in this chapter. As I said in the beginning only, that these macroeconomic indicators will be discussed along with their respective chapters. Inflation कितनी है, we'll discuss their money supply कितनी है, debt कितना है, current account balance, all these things we'll discuss in the respective chapter. NPA ratio, all these things we'll discuss in the respective chapter. Fine. There is a table given in your chapter 1 with respect to various macroeconomic indicators. I've used that table here, but specifically we'll talk about all these things in the respective chapters in detail. The chapter ends with certain supply side reforms as well. Certain supply side reforms that have been taken by the government. It also talks about those supply side reforms. One is a larger policy framework that the government has taken, which we discussed under our barbell strategy and that agile framework. That barbell strategy was more towards protecting people and then taking some decisions of investment, using that agile framework of continuous updation. The chapter also talks about multiple supply side reforms that have been taken. Now, what is this supply side reform? Supply side reforms are anything that assist in greater production or improvement of productivity. You produce more, as in businesses are incentivized to produce. Businesses' productivity increases. You get access to good technology, you get access to patents. There is a chapter that talks about patents specifically, access to patents and registration of new patents in the country. So the economic survey also talks about this chapter 1, this chapter 1 talks about certain supply side measures that have been taken. Again, in detail, these measures would be there in their respective chapters, but to be brief about these supply side reforms that have been taken. The economic survey talks about first the need for supply side reforms, and secondly, what exactly do supply side reforms entail? It says that there is a need for supply side reforms, as in need for improving the production environment, improving the business environment, because the post-pandemic world is not merely going to be a reflation of your current economy. In 2019, your GDP was something. In 2021, your GDP is something. You cannot simply reflate your current GDP and take it back to 2019 levels and say that all has been done, it's over. The reality of 2021, that is the post-pandemic world, the reality of post-pandemic world is going to be quite different. There will be multiple variable, multiple policy decisions. Every country is going to take certain decisions for itself. Like us, every other country is going to decide what is best for itself. For example, countries would try to reduce their dependence on those supply chains that are vulnerable. Today we are dependent upon China for many things. If there is something wrong that happens if there is some sort of disruption that happens causes disruption of trade between India and China, Chinese would then be exporting goods to us, or let's say Indians would then be importing goods from China from some third country. That causes an increase in costs for us. हमारे लिए costs बढ़ जाएंगी. So therefore our supply chain gets affected because of that. There is some sort of disruption because of freight rates, because of freight routes, because of some geopolitical tensions, because of some climate change steps that would be taken in future, that are being taken right now. There would be multiple unknowns. There are multiple unknowns that are taking shape right now. and these unknowns are going to interact with each other in unknown ways. We cannot simply bring our economy back to the pre-pandemic level and think that the job has been done. Our supply chain has now to become resilient, has now to become quote unquote what we call as Atmanirbhar. I'm sure by now everybody understands Atmanirbhar does not mean a return to protectionist era. Atmanirbhar simply means being Atmanirbhar, that is, you are self-dependent, you are resilient, you are not dependent upon some supply side restriction from China or from UK or from US. Your producers are able to source goods for the production from multiple sources. If China stops supply of API, you should be able to get them from other countries. If Iran or Saudi Arabia stops the supply of gas or oil to us, or let's say Indonesia stops the supply of coal to us, we should be able to get it from other sources. So we are trying to improve our resilience of our production, of our output, of our supply chain. That is what Atmanirbharta means. In pursuit of this, the economic survey say that certain steps have been taken, and this is the most critical part with respect to reforms that have been taken. There is a similar barbell strategy type strategy in supply side reforms as well. On one hand, they try to reap the low hanging fruits, and on other hand, they try to do some sort of process reforms. It talks about deregulation as well as process reforms or reforms. Deregulation matlab kya hai? It tries, what is the distinction between the term deregulation and reforms? Deregulation and process reforms. See, deregulation means, as the word suggests, to deregulate. A sector was previously highly regulated by the government, as in government was interfering in a sector where its presence was not necessary. Deregulate means that government presence from a particular sector is reducing. Presence of government from a sector is reducing because it is not required to be there. Versus process reforms, reform is presence of government is required, but government presence is creating obstacles. So you reform government presence. You want some sort of certificates, you want some sort of clearances, you want licenses, you want permissions from the government. Those permissions, licenses, certificates must be available in a manner that does not inhibit business. This is supply side reform that economic survey is talking about. It talks about deregulations as in the context of, let's say, privatization, and it talks about process reforms in the context of reforming the process so that even though government is present, its presence is not an obstacle to the private producer. This is what supply side reform, these are supply side reform that our economic survey is talking about. For example, it talks about deregulation of numerous sectors. It talks about simplification of multiple processes. Again, these will be detailed in later chapters. Removal of legacy issues such as retrospective taxes, privatization. For example, Air India, it gives the example of privatization of Air India. We'll talk about this. We'll talk about privatization part in our national monetization. अभी अगले chapter में हम बात करेंगे इसके बारे में. Production linked incentive schemes, as in giving incentive to producers so that they are able to produce more based on their production level. So this is with respect to that. Finally, economic survey also makes growth projections for future. This table is IMF projection, not economic survey's projection. Economic survey projects that Indian economy is going to grow at about 8 to 8.5%, which is less than projections made by other institutions such as IMF, World Bank, RBI or Government of India. जो budget division है उनके द्वारा. Projections made by government, that is budget division, RBI, IMF, World Bank, all those projections are on the higher side as compared to economic survey's projections. Economic survey gives its reasons. It says that there are uncertain times ahead, so we are giving an conservative forecast. Obviously, they would certainly be happy if India grows at a faster pace as compared to the forecast that they have given. They say that there are global supply shocks in waiting. For example, inflation is going to pick up, is already picking up. crude oil prices may pick up, again they are already picking up, or other commodity prices may pick up. They have assumed that the withdrawal of easy liquidity conditions from the global money supply would be on an orderly basis rather than on a shock basis. If US reduces the amount of money supply in their economy, that is by reducing their bond buying program, quantity of their bond buying program, it expects that it would be orderly, that means it would be properly communicated. So based on these assumptions, it has made a conservative forecast. Having said that, even after that conservative forecast, Indian economy is expected to grow at the fastest pace in the entire world this year. IMF projects that it is going to be around 9%. Our economic survey projects that it is going to be somewhere around 8.5%. Okay. So this is with respect to the first chapter, that is state of economy. I hope you have enjoyed and you have been able to understand, take away few key points from this chapter. As I said, this chapter is like a summary to the entire document, है ना? तो अगर जो लोग ये बोलते हैं कि हमको पूरा डॉक्यूमेंट नहीं पढ़ना है, पूरे 400 पेज नहीं पढ़ने हैं, तो कम से कम पहला चैप्टर तो पढ़ ही लेना. But I am not advising you to read first chapter only. My advice to you is to read the entire economic survey. Only when you read the entire economic survey will you be able to understand, appreciate various things. केवल अगर एग्जाम पर्सपेक्टिव से पढ़ना चाहते हो, only and only from exam perspective, please understand that you will be able to retain things only when you read it. अगर आप समरी पढ़ते हो, किसी भी चीज की समरी पढ़ते हो, तो आप समरी को ही रटते रह जाओगे. You will only be cramming up the summary document. Summary document will not explain things to you. Once you understand things by reading them completely, then you don't need to cram things up. Things will get automatically registered in your mind then. So that is why please read the entire document, revise from the summary. As I said, summary will be made available, revise from the summary. Fine? Chalo. Let's start our discussion on next chapter, that is fiscal developments. अगला चैप्टर स्टार्ट करते हैं, फिस्कल डेवलपमेंट्स. This chapter, fiscal development, again, the first chapter that we discussed was a broad chapter that talks about the entire state of economy. We have discussed some fiscal aspects also in that chapter. Here in this chapter, we'll discuss them in detail. Broadly, what is it that we are going to discuss? We'll discuss government's fiscal position. What is this fiscal position of the government? Fiscal position means, number one, revenues of the government or total receipts of the government. Second, expenditure of the government. पूरा कितना कमाया सरकार ने, कहां से कितना मिला और कितना स्पेंड किया, how much has it spent. Then you see that how much of the expenditure is from your borrowed amount. That means how much have you borrowed. What is your deficit? What is your debt level? We also briefly talk about sustainability of debt. In last year's economic survey, there was a detailed discussion on sustainability of debt. This year, they have referred, उन्होंने इस बार भी economic survey में नीचे लिखा है कि for a detailed discussion with respect to sustainability, you can refer to chapter 2 of last year economic survey. Yet, some parts of sustainability we will also see here. इतना डिटेल में तो नहीं जाएंगे हम जितना लास्ट ईयर, क्योंकि एक स्पेसिफिक चैप्टर था डेट सस्टेनेबिलिटी के ऊपर, तो हमने वहां पे डिस्कस किया था. दिस टाइम दे हैव अ चैप्टर ऑन फिस्कल डेवलपमेंट्स wherein they are talking about various aspects of various fiscal indicators of the government. They also talk briefly about debt sustainability. We'll also talk briefly about that. They also comment upon state government's finances, and they finally talk about improvement in expenditure, as in how do you improve the efficiency of your expenditure and how do you rationalize, how do you improve your revenues. Fiscal policy is basically about from where do you earn, how much do you earn, from where do you spend and how much do you spend. The balance between these two is achieved through borrowing, because usually you spend more as compared to what you earn more. The amount that you are borrowing in a particular year, that amount needs to be sustainable. You are borrowing some amount, that means you must have the capability to pay it back. Does the government have capability to pay it back? To reduce its amount that it is borrowing, it needs to ramp up its revenue, that is ramp up its earnings. It needs to rationalize or make its expenditure more efficient. So this is what this chapter is about, the chapter on fiscal developments. ये हम बात करेंगे इस chapter के अंदर, ठीक है? So let's start. As we discussed in the beginning of chapter 1, the response of rest of the world versus response of Indian government. Thankfully, Indian government's economic advisors in 2020-21 have been really good. Most of the advice that anybody outside the government was giving was based on the policy being adopted by rest of the world. सभी क्या बोल रहे थे? सरकार पैसा खर्च ही नहीं कर रही है. सरकार ने क्या किया? पैसा खर्च नहीं किया. जापान ने इतना पैसा खर्च कर दिया, अमेरिका ने इतना कर दिया, इंडियन गवर्नमेंट तो कुछ नहीं किया. सब लोग, एंड you will try to invoke emotional images of, let's say, people dying, people traveling thousands of kilometers, and say that government has not done anything. So obviously those who are outside the government, they can, everybody has freedom of expression, they can say whatever they want. Thankfully, government of India was advised by reasonable economic advisors. The result is for everybody to see right now. As we discussed, as we looked at in the last slide, Indian economy is going to be, even at a conservative estimate, the fastest growing economy of the world. We are amongst a handful of economies. There are only about 10 economies of the world which have recovered past the pre-pandemic level. According to IMF, पूरी दुनिया में 10 economies ही हैं जो अपने pre-pandemic level से recover कर चुकी हैं, and we are amongst them. The rate at which we will be growing is the fastest. Thankfully, the government of India's response, policy response, was not like other countries which front loaded the expenditure in one go. Waterfall model. आपने assess कर लिया, you think that you know what this pandemic is. Most of the countries, Japan, US, Germany, France, most of these countries, their response to this pandemic in the year 2020 was that all of them front loaded the expenditure. Front loaded का मतलब पहले ही expenditure commit कर दिया. We will provide this much money to people, in hands of people, so that they can spend. Point is, money was provided to people, many deserving, some undeserving. Money was provided to people directly by those countries. At the same time, supply was not allowed to respond. Why do you provide money in hands of people? क्यों आप provide करते हो? You provide money in hands of people so that people can spend it, more production can take place, people can get employed, and therefore they can start to earn their wages. You provide money in hands of people, I'll repeat, there is a cycle here. Cycle is you provide money in hands of people so that they can meet their basic requirements. They don't, for example, die because of lack of access to their basic necessities. You provide money in hands of people so that they spend more. When they spend more, producers will produce more. Producers produce more, therefore they need more people to get employed. More people will return to employment, will get employed, and will start earning back. This is the idea behind giving those, behind incurring those expenses, giving that money to the people. However, if you simply give money to the people and do not allow the supply side to respond, producers are constrained because global supply chains are dysfunctional. Producers are constrained because there is restriction on movement, restriction on production. तो producers तो constrained हैं और आपने लोगों के हाथ में पैसा दे दिया है. End result is either this money is saved or there will be inflation, and there will be inflation. Almost entire world right now is undergoing inflation, is facing lot of inflation. India is no exception. We are also facing inflation. Inflation in rest of the world is largely because there has been so much easy money that has been provided. So in rest of the world, the central bank now has to put brakes on their monetary policy. Americans, Germans, English, British, Japanese, everybody is now actively considering and causing havocs in rest of the world by saying that they are going to reduce their money supply. Governments are reducing their fiscal expansion because they are faced with lot of inflation in their economies. If same thing had happened in Indian economy, today RBI would also be talking about increasing interest rates or reducing money supply. Thankfully, RBI has a little bit of headroom today. Headroom as in, obviously there is inflation in India. Obviously, to control inflation, there will be an increase in interest rate. But thankfully, because inflation in India is not because of excess money supply. It is because of imported inflation from abroad. Commodity prices from abroad are getting expensive. That is why we are witnessing high inflation in India. Inflation is because we had got a low base last year. Last year prices, WPI was in negative. तो लो बेस है, उसके ऊपर ऑब्वियसली हमको ज्यादा परसेंटेज में दिखेगा. फैक्ट तो है, हाँ यस इंडिया में भी इन्फ्लेशन है, बट इन्फ्लेशन इन इंडिया इज CPI is in within our tolerance range, that is less than 6%. WPI is certainly in double digits, that's a problem, but WPI is high because number one of low base last year and number two because of imported inflation. Imported मतलब कि बाहर से जो commodities आ रही हैं, most importantly crude oil and other commodities, they are expensive. Inflation in India is not attributable to high money supply. I hope this makes sense. This is clear to everybody. Because of this, RBI has got a bit headroom so that it can continue to support the economy using low interest rates for a longer time as compared to others. It has got some headroom so that it can continue to make money available at a relatively cheaper rate of interest as compared to other countries which are now reeling with the event where their central banks would have to reduce money supply. Probably economy is not at the pre-pandemic level. India's approach has been far better as compared to other countries which had front-loaded their expenditures. India's approach has been, as we discussed, that Barbell Strategy agile framework based on continuous policy iteration, reflected in our fiscal responses. Our fiscal response was, first, we tried to provide that safety net. हमारा फर्स्ट फिस्कल रिस्पॉन्स था दैट वी ट्राई टू प्रोवाइड सेफ्टी नेट बाय एंश्योरिंग दैट पीपल गेट बेसिक एक्सपेंसेस, पीपल गेट मनी फॉर बेसिक एक्सपेंसेस. देयर इज अ टेबल गिवन इन योर इकोनॉमिक सर्वे. आई वुड आस्क यू टू प्लीज मार्क दैट टेबल. एक टेबल है आपके इकोनॉमिक सर्वे में इन विच देयर इज समरी गिवन ऑफ ऑल द स्टेप्स दैट गवर्नमेंट हैड टेकन लास्ट ईयर एंड लास्ट टू लास्ट ईयर विद रिस्पेक्ट टू प्रोवाइडिंग सेफ्टी नेट्स टू वल्नरेबल सेक्शंस इंक्लूडिंग बिजनेसेस. एमएसएमई को कैसे सपोर्ट किया सरकार ने, रूरल इकोनॉमी को कैसे सपोर्ट किया, हाउ डिड गवर्नमेंट प्रोवाइड फॉर एग्जांपल प्रधानमंत्री गरीब अन्न योजना इन विच गवर्नमेंट प्रोवाइडेड सब्सिडाइज्ड फूड ग्रेन्स टू अबाउट 90 crores beneficiaries of NFSA, National Food Security Program. Government provided 500 rupees per month directly to the account of Jan Dhan account holders. State government topped it with their own contributions. Government provide guarantees of credit to MSMEs. Multiple steps were taken so that protection to vulnerable sections was provided. So that was the first part of government strategy. Rather than front loading all the expense, government chose to spend on protection first. And then in a calibrated manner, government chose to invest, government chose to spend money so that as the economy opens up, जैसे जैसे economy open हो, वैसे वैसे economy में investment बढ़े, वैसे वैसे economy में demand बढ़े. The demand side, the investment side of expenditure was taken up slowly, gradually. Rather than doing all this in one go, government did it in stages in a calibrated manner. So this has been India's fiscal approach. Let's look at some fiscal indicators. Before we look at fiscal indicators, again there is a chart in your economic survey. These pie charts, these pie diagrams, they represent the changing composition of government support. सरकार की जो changing composition of support की. For example, in the first stage, government support was largely in form of food and providing livelihood. MG नरेगा के अंदर government was providing livelihood plus providing subsidized food grains to a lot of people. So most of government response was focused towards this. Later on, government response changed towards providing liquidity support to firms, boosting demand to some extent, agriculture sector and other liquidity measure. Later on, government support changed towards 50-50 about consumption boosting and investment boosting. Later on, government support changed more towards investment boosting, that is increasing capital expenditure further and other aspects as well. This has been the government support in the year 2021, which consists of liquidity enhancing measures, export boosting measures, again food and health boosting measures are already there. So this is what government's response, this is how government's response has evolved since the pandemic began. Rather than front loading all the expenses in one go, it has moved in a strategic, calibrated manner. Let's discuss various fiscal indicators. Very, very important, extremely important. Prelims point of view, mains point of view. As I said when we began this chapter, in this chapter we'll have a look at receipts of the government, that is revenue receipts and capital receipts. We'll break them down into debt and non-debt receipts. We look at expenses, revenue expense and capital expense. We look at deficits, we look at debt and its sustainability, efforts towards expenditure rationalization and revenue mobilization. This is what we are going to see in this topic. This table is very important. Not these numbers. ये numbers तो इकोनॉमिक सर्वे जिन्होंने पब्लिश किया है उनके लिए इंपॉर्टेंट है, बजट डिवीजन वालों के लिए इंपॉर्टेंट है और इकोनॉमिक सर्वे डिवीजन वालों के लिए इंपॉर्टेंट. फॉर अस these numbers are not that important. Not that, again it is important but not that important. For us primary importance is what is written here. यहां पे जो लिखा है ये सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट है हमारे लिए. What are revenue receipts? What are gross tax revenue, assignment to state, tax revenue, non-tax revenue, non-debt capital receipt, total non-debt receipt, total expense, revenue, capital, different types of deficit. For us, what is important is that we understand what all these terms are. This year question, इस साल का सवाल मेंस में है, इस साल का 2021 मेंस, 2021 मेंस, the question is distinguish between the capital and distinguish between the revenue and capital account of the budget. Question in this year's mains, 2021 mains, is they are asking you to distinguish between capital and revenue account of the budget. You must know what goes in capital, what goes in revenue, what comes out of capital, what comes out of revenue. Capital expense and receipts, revenue expense and receipt. For us this is very important. ये हमारे लिए ज्यादा important चीज है. Prelims में regularly there is a question. They ask which of the following is capital expenditure, which of the following is revenue expenditure, which of the following is a capital receipt, which of the following is a revenue receipt. They ask these questions quite frequently. So please, for us this understanding is important. To be very quick, anything that has effect on liabilities and assets is part of capital account. Anything that does not is part of revenue account. Anything that affects government's assets and liabilities will be in capital account. Anything that does not will be in revenue account. Revenue account consists of expenditures and revenue receipts. Revenue expenses are expenses that government incurs because of it has to perform its sovereign functions. Expenses incurred in performance of its sovereign duties are revenue expenses. Revenue receipts, receipts that the government collects, money that the government collects as a matter of right. As a matter of right, whatever money the government collects, that is government's revenue receipts. Tax जो सरकार collect करती है, that is government's right. Non-tax revenue such as fee it charges for something. आप civil service का form भरते हो, एक fee pay करते हो, that is government's right. Fines that government levy, you have broken down, I'm sorry, You have broken some traffic rule and you are supposed to pay a fine. That is government's right to collect it. Fines that government collects, part of non-tax revenue, it's a government's right. Money that government collects which belongs to the government, which is government's right, that is revenue receipt. Anything that has effect on assets and liabilities, that goes in capital account. Capital expenditure क्या है? Anything that leads to creation of assets or reduction of liability, that is capital expenditure. Capital receipt क्या है? Capital receipt is anything that leads to, anything that is on account of reduction of assets or increase of liability is a capital receipt. कैपिटल रिसीट, रिडक्शन ऑफ एसेट, सरकार ने बीएसएनएल को बेच दिया, सरकार ने एयर इंडिया को बेच दिया, गवर्नमेंट सेल्स एयर इंडिया, सो इट हैज सोल्ड एन एसेट. मनी दैट गवर्नमेंट रिसीव्स इज गवर्नमेंट्स कैपिटल रिसीट. Government borrows some money, government has borrowed some money, that is creating a liability for government. Borrowing money, money is coming to the government, but at the same time it is creating liability for the government, that is government's capital receipt. This distinction is very important. This knowledge about this is important. As I said, the question this year, distinguish between capital budget and revenue budget, explain the components of both these budgets. Question has been asked this year. Please make sure that you know this. Here we have the trend of growth rates of various components of these fiscal indicators. We have trend in revenue receipts, tax receipts, gross tax, non-tax, debt capital, non-debt capital receipts. We have trend of these things. We'll discuss about these things in detail in next few slides. Let's look at the receipts of the government. सरकार की receipts देखते हैं. Government's receipts, as I said, can be classified into two types: revenue and capital. Revenue receipts comprise of tax and non-tax revenue. Capital receipt comprise of debt and non-debt capital receipt. Anything that has effect on government's assets and liability, that would go into capital account. Fine. Receipts of the government. So this is what the trend of receipts of the government is. कई सारे सवाल इसमें पूछे जा सकते हैं. Many questions that can be asked in the exam. We'll discuss some of those questions. If you look at these two charts, the first chart tells you about growth in major direct and indirect taxes during April to November 2021. How has corporate tax grown, income tax, customs, GST, union excise duty, how have all these taxes grown? This is growth rate. कितना growth हुआ है? If you look here, corporate tax has grown by about 90%. पिछले साल से around 90% growth है corporate tax का. Over last year, corporate tax has grown by about 90%. Question may be about low tax base of the country. Question may be with respect to steps that can be taken to improve tax collection. Question may be with respect to why has tax collection risen in the post-COVID year. इस साल कई बार हमने देखा government has quote unquote advertised and government has talked about this many times that we are seeing a robust improvement in tax collections. So सवाल पूछा जा सकता है आपसे एग्जाम में that what are the reasons for an increased tax collection by the government in a pandemic year or in 2021? How has government been able to collect more amount of taxes? What steps can be taken in order to improve tax collection? Such question may be asked. For answering such questions, you need to know the reasons here, you need to know some trends here. Corporate tax increased by 90%, customs duty increased by about 99.5%, that is about 100%. GST is increasing by about 36% as compared to last year. The reasons are, yes, there is an increase in profits and therefore corporate tax is increasing. Reasons are there is formalization of economy, that is another reason. Reasons are that there is increased compliance due to certain taxation reforms that have been undertaken. At the end of this chapter, there are certain taxation reforms that are mentioned in the annex. I'll briefly talk about them at the end. I'll ask you to read them on your own specifically if you do want to read them. I'll talk about them. रिफॉर्म्स की बात जो मैंने यहां पे करी है, दिस इज बीइंग टॉक्ड अबाउट एट द एंड ऑफ दिस चैप्टर. हाउ कैन टैक्स कलेक्शन बी इंक्रीज, what steps have been taken that have led to the current increase in tax collection. I'll talk about them at the end of this chapter. ठीक है. A pertinent question, questions that have been asked multiple times in exams with respect to composition of various taxes, which tax contributes maximum. सवाल कई बार पूछा है. Again, you should know these trends. आपको ये ट्रेंड्स मालूम होने चाहिए. Out of the total tax that government collects, about 50% comes from direct taxes and 50% comes from indirect taxes. ये मालूम होना चाहिए हमको. About 25% of total tax is corporate tax. About 25% of total tax is income tax. Largest contributor to total tax is GST. GST का अकेले का contribution around 30% है. The tax which comprises of largest contribution to government revenues is GST, which comprises about 30%. 25% is corporate, 25% is income, and remaining are excise duty and customs. ठीक है. So this is very important for us to know. ये trend हमको जानना, ये composition जानना जरूरी है. This is a breakdown of this. This is a breakdown of this. What are the various components? As in, this is corporate tax, taxes on income, customs, excise duty, GST. These are the various breakdowns of these different taxes. As a percentage of GDP, which tax comprises how much? This is what the breakdown is. As you can see, as a percentage of GDP, GST is around 2.8% of GDP. Income tax, corporate tax are about 2.5% each. Excise is 1.5, custom is 1.6. Now, this is okay that we have been able to understand this. इसको हमें अभी apply भी करना है. We will apply this. From prelims point of view, what is important to know is composition. From prelims point of view, we want to know that which tax has what contribution, or more precisely, what is the order of contribution of various taxes. This is from prelims. From mains point of view, we will have to do analysis. We'll have to understand what is the total tax to GDP ratio of the country. कितनी है total tax to GDP ratio? 2.5 और 2.5, 5, 5 and 2.8, 7.8, 7.8 and 0.6, 8.4, 8.4 and 1.5, 9.9. 9.9% is the total tax to GDP ratio of central government. लगभग 9.9% is the total tax to GDP ratio of central government. Please keep this fact in mind about the 9.9% being total tax to GDP ratio, and we'll come back to this when we are discussing deficits. Deficit जब हम discuss करेंगे तब हम इसको discuss करेंगे. GST collections have been almost continuously rising. Now GST collections, average GST collection in last quarter was about 1.3 lakh crore. Last quarter in last quarter GST collection was about 1.3 lakh crore. If you look at the entire year, it is about 1.1 lakh crore for the entire year. So GST collections have been rising. Average monthly collections are this. This is trends in non-tax revenue. Again, trends not, ये वाला trend तो important है, सवाल इससे जरूर पूछ सकते हैं. नॉन टैक्स रेवेन्यू के कंपोनेंट्स क्या हैं? नॉन टैक्स रेवेन्यू कंप्राइजेज ऑफ डिविडेंड्स एंड प्रॉफिट्स दैट द गवर्नमेंट रिसीव्स फ्रॉम पीएसयूज. नॉन टैक्स रेवेन्यू कंप्राइजेज ऑफ आरबीआईज सरप्लस ट्रांसफर्स टू द गवर्नमेंट. इट कंप्राइजेज ऑफ इंटरेस्ट दैट गवर्नमेंट रिसीव्स ऑन लोन दैट इट हैज गिवन. इट कंप्राइजेज ऑफ fees, charges, fines, etc. that government levies. These are various components of non-tax revenue. Exam में पूछा जा सकता है, what are the various components of non-tax revenue? Interest that government collects on loans that it has given. When somebody pays back the principal, that is a capital receipt. When somebody pays back only the interest, that is revenue receipt. So interest received by government on loans that it gives, revenue receipt, non-tax revenue receipt. Fines, charges, fees that government receives, non-tax revenue receipt. Dividends and profits that government receives from PSU. ONGC makes a profit of 1000 crores and it gives a profit of 800 crores to the government because it is the largest shareholder. Non-tax revenue receipts. Profits that the government is receiving from ONGC. RBI's surplus transfer. RBI has earned an income of 1 lakh crore. RBI transfers an income of 80,000 crore to the government in a year. Example of non-tax revenue receipt. All these are part of non-tax revenue. Non-tax revenue receipts have been rising. Very important thing for us to know. Non-tax revenue receipts increase कर रहे हैं, ये हमको जानना जरूरी है, याद करना जरूरी है. Largely this is because of rise in RBI's transfer to the government. RBI's transfers has increased and therefore non-tax revenue has increased. Other components have also been increasing, as in profits and dividends that government receive, that is increasing largely वो भी increase कर रहा है. Whereas if we look at interest payments that the government receives, repayment of loans, that is principal amount that the government receives, which is capital receipt, and when we look at other non-debt capital receipt, they have not been increasing. If we look at some components, यहाँ के जो components हैं हमने देखे, tax receipts are increasing, non-tax revenue receipts, they are also increasing. Some receipts of the government are not increasing. The receipts which are not increasing are largely the non-debt capital receipts. Non-debt capital receipts of the government, they are not increasing because non-debt capital receipts largely comprise of the principal that government receives from the loans that it has given and disinvestment proceeds. It is important for us to distinguish between two things: disinvestment versus dividend and principal versus interest payment. ये दो चीजों में distinction करना जरूरी है. We need to know the difference between disinvestment versus dividends. We need to know the difference between principal versus interest. When government sells something, that is disinvestment. When government sells, it receives money on selling that asset. This is part of non-debt capital. ये non-debt capital receipt का part है. Non-debt capital receipt. When government receives dividends from a company, it has not sold the company, it has simply received profits from the company that it owns. This is part of non-tax revenue. ये non-tax revenue receipt है. Exactly similar is this. Government has given a loan. Government of India ने किसी को loan दिया है. Let's say loan to states. Government of India has given a loan to states. When some state repays this loan, कोई state वापस करेगा, then it pays some principal component plus some interest component. The principal component that is repaid, principal, this is again a part of non-debt capital receipt. Government is not incurring a debt. Non-debt मतलब जहां पे सरकार debt incur करे. Wherever government is incurring a debt, that is non-debt. Is not incurring a debt, that is non-debt. Wherever it incurs a debt, that is debt. It is a capital receipt. Government is receiving back money, so this principal is being received by the government, becomes an example of non-debt capital receipt. Versus interest. Government receives interest on the loan that it has given, not the principal, only the interest. Interest is part of non-tax revenue. Interest received is part of non-tax revenue. Principal received is part of non-debt capital. Disinvestment is part of non-debt capital. Dividend is part of non-tax revenue. We must understand this distinction. Whereas government's tax receipts and other non-tax receipts have been rising, government's non-debt capital receipts have not been rising. It is largely attributable to its inability to disinvest. Government has not been able to disinvest according to how much it had budgeted, and that is why disinvestment receipts are far lower than what it had budgeted for. Government expected that it will be able to collect around 1.5 lakh crore. सरकार ने budget लास्ट ईयर जब बजट प्रेजेंट किया था, गवर्नमेंट एक्सपेक्टेड दैट वी विल बी एबल टू कलेक्ट अराउंड 1.5 लाख करोड़ थ्रू वेरियस डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट्स, whereas actual collection is somewhere around 10,000 crore, लगभग 10,000 करोड़ है. So government has been able to get very less of the total amount that it had budgeted from disinvestment. Disinvestments have not been able to take place, therefore this receipt is less. Secondly, loans given by government to states, which was another part of your non-debt capital receipt, they have also decreased. Pursuant to recommendations of the Finance Commission, now larger part of government's transfers to states are not in form of loans, rather than they are in form of states' right. Because Finance Commission has increased the state shares in the total devolution, total taxes, therefore government of India now gives less loan to states, number one. Second, pursuant to recommendations of 12th Finance Commission, 12वीं Finance Commission, states are now allowed to raise money directly from market. States market से directly loan ले सकते हैं. Very important point, they asked this question few years back in the exam, in prelims, that can states issue treasury bills. Last year they asked question with respect to debt level of central government. Last year they asked question with respect to external debt of government. They are asking questions with respect to debt. तो डेट से रिलेटेड एक सवाल जिसके बारे में आपको मालूम होना चाहिए, states are allowed to borrow from market. Earlier states were not allowed to borrow from market, now states are allowed to borrow from market. This is very important thing. Because states can now borrow directly from market, therefore their dependence on government of India has reduced. Because their dependence on government of India has reduced, therefore this principal component, this has also reduced. सरकार ने जब लोन दे ही नहीं रखा तो वापस क्या लेगी? So therefore non-debt capital receipts of the government are reducing. In context of this, we must also understand the new public sector enterprise policy. Public sector enterprise policy, there is a box. This has been taken directly from a box in your economic survey. In your economic survey, there is a box with respect to history of disinvestment. How has disinvestment taken place through ages in our country? It talks about first the first amendment to the constitution. पहली amendment जो constitution की थी, which put restrictions on article 19. 19(1)(g) क्या कहता है? 19(1)(g) says you have the right to carry out business. 19(1)(a), b, c, d, e, f, g. G part क्या कहता है? Clause G says that you have a right to carry out business, trade and business of your choice. There are restrictions on 91(g) that were put because of first constitutional amendment. Under that, your right to do business can be restrained for public good, public welfare. Pursuant to this, government enacted multiple nationalizations, legislations. First, the government nationalized LIC, Life Insurance Corporation को nationalize किया. There were multiple life insurers in the country, some domestic, some foreigner. All of them were amalgamated into one through nationalization, and you formed one entity, LIC. You nationalized Imperial Bank of India into SBI then. In 1970, you nationalized 14 banks forcefully. In 1980, you further nationalized 6 more banks. क्या मतलब वो nationalization का? Nationalization means that there was some private sector person who was doing his or her business. That person was given an option कि भाई ये लो पैसे और अपना business मुझे सौंप दो. Forcefully nationalizing. Coal mines were nationalized during 1970s. Air India was nationalized. अभी वापस से privatization हुआ है. Air India and some other airlines were together nationalized. Multiple airlines were operating. They were together nationalized and then formed into 2 sub companies. One for domestic, that was Indian Airlines, and one for foreign, that was Air India. So multiple companies were nationalized for this. Then started the process of disinvestment from 1991. It picked up during Vajpayee's era in 1999 when Department of Disinvestment was set up. In 2001, a separate ministry was set up for disinvestment. It gathered pace a little bit in the next years as well. Since 2014, we have tried to come up with a new the government has tried to come up with a new department called DIPAM. DIPAM Department of Public Assets Management, DPAM, Niti Aayog and DPAM, they have been advising government with respect to the pace and strategy for disinvestment. Which sectors can we disinvest in? Which sector can the government disinvest from? Where is presence of government required? How is presence of government required? All this is there. We have a new Public Sector Enterprise Policy, PSE policy. ये PSE policy क्या कहती है? PSE policy, please pay attention, PSE policy intends to minimize the presence of government in PSEs across all sectors of the economy. PSE policy intends to minimize the presence of government in all sectors of the economy. Under this policy, public sector commercial enterprises have been classified as strategic and non-strategic sectors. In strategic sectors, government will maintain its presence either directly or through regulations. In non-strategic sectors, government is expected to reduce its presence completely in some time. PSE policy, Public Sector Enterprise Policy. This policy begs a question in your mains exam. Do you think that government has business to be in business? Do you think government has business to be in business? Question. Do you think the government has business to be in business? Comment in light of the new Public Sector Enterprise Policy for Atmanirbhar Bharat. क्या सरकार को बिजनेस में होना चाहिए या नहीं होना चाहिए? Comment in light of new PSE policy. This PSE policy talks about this PSE policy classifies government's PSUs into two types, strategic and non-strategic. Strategic being, for example, atomic energy, railways, transport, telecommunication, petroleum, power, space, defense, etc. Banking and financial services, all the example of strategic sectors. Government says that we will maintain our presence here and certainly we will continue to regulate here. In this sector, we will pursue process reforms, regulations, but at the same time process reforms. जैसे economic survey gives example of rationalization of drones policy. A rationalization of drones policy entails less number of registrations when it comes to drones, less number of regulations, flying drones, etc. Come regulations of drone pe so that this sector can pick up. So this is what government's PSE policy is, Public Sector Enterprise Policy, to reduce its presence in non-strategic sectors and continue with presence in strategic sectors in form of regulations and in form of direct presence. Okay. In continuation of this, there is our asset monetization pipeline. Asset monetization. We have a national infrastructure pipeline. हमारी एक NIP है, National Infrastructure Pipeline. Under that national infrastructure pipeline, multiple infrastructure projects have been envisaged which the government expects to complete in next 5 years. How will those infrastructure projects be financed? Where will money come from? Some money will come from central government, some from state government, some from private sector. Where will money for central government and private and state government come from? Government does not have enough money so that it can provide. Government is incurring already a revenue deficit. That means government has to borrow money to perform its sovereign functions. Where will government get money for increasing capital expenditure? अभी हम देखेंगे capital expenditure has increased by about 35% over last year. Where is government going to get this money from? So government envisages an asset monetization program or an asset monetization pipeline which can help in funding this national infrastructure pipeline. पैसा कहां से आएगा? एग्जाम में सवाल ये पूछा सकता है. They can ask a question in the exam. Where will money come from for all these things? Asset monetization is not privatization. Please understand this. Asset monetization does not mean government is privatizing. Privatize तो सरकार कर ही रही है. लेकिन प्राइवेटाइजेशन इज डिफरेंट फ्रॉम एसेट मोनेटाइजेशन. दीज टू आर डिफरेंट थिंग्स. Privatization is government has identified which PSU to divest from, which PSU to make go public, or which PSU which PSU to sell. Government has identified all those things. So strategic and non-strategic sector classification is for that PSC policy. Asset monetization is something else. Asset monetization is to raise money by monetizing your present asset. For example, government has railway stations. Railway stations are Government of India property, as in Ministry of Railways property. Railway tracks are Ministry of Railways properties. Land along those railway tracks is Ministry of Railways or Government of India's properties. Government wants to monetize them. That means government wants to raise money using those assets. For example, on railway stations, on railway land, if you allow hoardings to come up, advertisements to go up, if you allow that, you can collect revenue from those advertisements. So that is one way of monetizing an asset. एक asset है और उससे monetize कर रहे हो आप. You are trying to raise money using that particular asset. There are various instruments that are being talked about with respect to how will money be raised. That is, how will this monetization take place? How will this monetization take place? As of now, we have not yet started with this monetization as such. There is a National Land Monetization Corporation that has been set up. National Land Monetization Corporation, NLMC. This NLMC has been set up for monetizing of assets. However, as of now, we have not yet monetized anything. There are plans which instruments can be used for monetization. For example, कुछ public private partnership में कुछ करेंगे, from that they will try to raise some money. They may issue some sort of bonds, some infrastructure bonds can be issued so that they can raise money using these assets as security. That is also an example of monetization. I'll explain this briefly. Government has, for example, land somewhere. Government has a building of BSNL at prime location in a city. Government can rent out that location to somebody who is willing to buy that office, who is willing to set their office there. BSNL की building है, वहां पे you have got lot of land, lot of empty spaces, people have taken VRS. You have got a building that belongs to government. Now that building can be lent out to somebody, can be rented out to somebody. Asset monetization 1. Second, again you have got that building has some value. Let's say value of that building is 100 crores. You can use that building as a security to get some loan. अगर मुझे कोई loan चाहिए, if I want some loan, I can use my house as a security and get a loan based on that house. Similarly, government wants some loan, government can use this particular asset as a security and get some loan from somewhere. So these are various ways. You can lend out some place for office purposes. You can ask somebody to set up their hoardings, lend out advertisement space. You can use this asset as a security to borrow money from banks. These are various ways through which you can monetize these assets. Niti Aayog is the entity that has been advising government with respect to this national monetization pipeline. Niti Aayog is telling government that which instruments can it use. As of now they have not yet started, but it is expected that they are going to raise about 6 lakh crore rupees. Unka expectation hai that they can raise around 6 lakh crore rupees by using these, by monetizing these assets. I'll repeat, this is not privatization. Privatization is different. BSNL को बेच देना is different from BSNL की बिल्डिंग अपने पास रखना और उसके अंदर किसी को ऑफिस बनाने के लिए किराए पे दे देना. These two are different things. Privatization is what we discussed in the previous slide. Monetization is what we have discussed now. So this is asset monetization program of the government. So we have discussed receipts of the government now. In receipts we discussed tax receipts, we discussed non-tax receipts. We discussed capital receipts as in non-debt capital receipt. डेट कैपिटल रिसीट्स हम अब डिस्कस करेंगे एक्सपेंडिचर डिस्कस करने के बाद. विल डिस्कस डेट कैपिटल रिसीट. We'll discuss debt capital receipt, that is basically our fiscal deficit, once we discuss our revenue, our expenditure. So these are various components of expenditure of the government. This is revenue expenditure of the government. Revenue expenditure, as I said, expenditure that government incurs in order to perform its sovereign function, that is revenue expenditure. Salaries that government pays, pensions, interest payments, major subsidies, defense services. These are the biggest components of total revenue expense of the government. सरकार का total revenue expense हम देखें, total revenue expenses, salaries paid, very large component. Interest payment is the largest one. If you look at this, अगर आप इस चार्ट में देखो तो you can already see interest payment is about 4.81 lakh crores और बाकी सब उससे कम है. So interest payment is the biggest component. So they can ask this question in the exam. Arrange the following components of revenue expenditure in increasing order. Revenue expenditure के जो components हैं, arrange them in increasing order. Interest payment is biggest. Interest payment is the biggest component. ये ध्यान रखना है आपको. Interest payment is the largest component of total government expenses. After interest payments, we have got major subsidies. Major subsidies काफी बड़ा component होता है. Major subsidies are the next biggest component, subsidies. Subsidies. Then you have got salaries and defense. Salaries, pensions, and defense. Salaries and pensions is 2.52 lakh crores. Defense is about 2.1 lakh crores. So this is the component. Very important for you to know. Interest is the biggest, subsidy is the next, salaries, pension, and then defense. More important for us to see is the composition of revenue expenditure. If we look at revenue expenditure, we know that interest component is the biggest component. Interest that the central government pays. On what will central government pay interest? Central government will pay an interest on its own borrowings, So central government borrows some money this year. On that money it pays interest, but it continues to pay interest on the money that it has borrowed this year for many next years. Manmohan Singh ji borrowed some money in the year 2005. Interest will continue to be paid on that money for next many years. Till about 2050, interest will continue to be paid on the money that was borrowed in 2005. So, interest payments are on accumulated debt. Interest payments are incurred on accumulated debt. That means any borrowing that has been done in past, on that interest is paid. Most of the expense that we see here, salaries, pension, interest, subsidies and defense, most of the expense is committed expense. इसको हम बोलते हैं committed. It is called as committed expenditure. Committed meaning that most of this expense cannot be usually tampered with by the government. अब सरकार ने सैलरी पे करनी है तो करनी है. इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट तो सरकार को 100% करना ही करना है. Salaries, pension, subsidies, there is not much scope with the government to reduce them. Especially in case of interest, there is zero scope. Interest के केस में there is absolutely zero scope on with the government to reduce interest, to not pay interest payment. If government defaults on its interest, it will cause a havoc in the economy. If government cannot pay back the interest on the money that it has borrowed. On salaries, it can reduce like it did in 2020 by stopping dearness allowance payments for some months. Subsidies, it may cut, but it usually is not politically possible for it to cut down subsidies as well. Therefore, most of this is committed. Out of this committed, if you remove interest payment, अगर हम interest payment remove कर दें, very important thing that I hope all of you already know, primary deficit, अभी देखेंगे हम 2 मिनट बाद, primary deficit is equals to fiscal deficit minus interest payment. Primary deficit is fiscal deficit minus interest payment. If we look at non-interest revenue expenditure versus total I'm sorry, if you look at non-interest revenue expenditure versus capital expenditure, non-interest revenue expenditure has not grown by that much amount as total revenue expenditure. Non-interest revenue expenditure, your revenue expenditure comprises of interest payment, which is the largest component, and non-interest wala. Interest payment has drastically increased, non-interest has also increased but not that much. Non-interest भी increase हुआ है लेकिन interest payment काफी ज्यादा increase हुई है. Increase in non-interest revenue expenditure is not that much, whereas increase in capital expenditure has been very high. So this is the feature of expenditure incurred by the government in last few years, last 2 years to be precise. One important thing, yes, very important thing, I'm sorry I forgot. One important thing, as compared to 2020, as compared to 2020, revenue expenditure in 2021 has decreased. As compared to 2020, revenue expenditure in 2021 was less. Very important thing. Usually revenue expenditure has not decreased, but as compared to 2020, expenditure in 2021, revenue expense, revenue not total, revenue expense in 2021 was less. It is largely because revenue expenditure in 2020 was very high. 2020 में बहुत ज़्यादा था क्योंकि subsidies के ऊपर amount of revenue expense that you incurred on subsidies was about 200 times, I'm sorry, 200% more, मतलब दुगने से ज़्यादा था. Expenditure incurred on subsidies in the year 2020 was about 2 times more. Specifically on food subsidies, it was about 4 times more. So, because there was very high revenue expenditure in the year 2020, hence in 2021, revenue expenditure was a little bit less than what it was in 2020. Very important point to know. This is with respect to capital expenditure. Capital expenditure, as all of you know, capex, सबने सुना ही होगा. Government's focus on capex or capital expenditure. Government is trying to increase capital expenditure. It's part of its strategy, that barbell strategy. Government invests money and therefore it expects that there will be better returns on that money. Government invests money in investment in infrastructure, in giving some sort of incentives which improve the supply side. All of that is capital expenditure. When government invests that money, it expects that there is going to be some sort of multiplier effect in the economy. As in, if you invest 1 rupees in infrastructure, it is expected to reap you about, let's say, 10 rupees. Whereas if you put 1 rupee in revenue expense, it is going to come back only as 1 rupee. So government expects a multiplier effect from capital expenditure, and that is why it is increasing the share of capital expenditure in total expense. Capital expense as a share of total expenditure was somewhere around 12 to 14%, has been in this range. In fact, before that, before 2014, capital expenditure was even less than 12%. Usually capital expenditure was about 10% of total budget and revenue expenditure was 90% of total budget. Since 2014, we have seen an increase in capital expenditure, but still it was not very high. Last year and this year, government has given a boost to capital expense. At present, it is somewhere around 16% of total expense. आज की तारीख में सरकार एक्सपेक्ट करी कि लगभग 16% है. This year, further it has been increased. इकोनॉमिक सर्वे के अगले दिन बजट आया है. So this year it has further been increased. This year it has been increased a bit further. So from about 16%, they are expecting to take it to around 18% this year. So this is about capital expenditure, trend in capex. Next is continuing with our expenses. We have looked at revenue expense, we have looked at capital expense. We are now looking at expenditure with respect to states. Here we talk about expenditure which has been recommended by 15 Finance Commission. 15 Finance Commission, again question have been asked multiple times in prelims. 15 Finance Commission के ऊपर, as in various Finance Commission के ऊपर, what have been the recommendations? Some of the recommendations I mentioned here in detail. You may go through your economic survey. I'll talk about them. मैं यहाँ पे बात कर लेता हूँ उनके बारे में. Recommendations of Finance Commission that are there. First is increased devolution to states, which is under Article 275. What does our Article 275 state? Article 275 is with respect to transfer of money from center to states on account of gaps in their revenue, revenue filling grants. अगर स्टेट का रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट है, इफ एनी स्टेट हैज अ रेवेन्यू डेफिसिट, देन सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट ट्राइज टू ट्रांसफर मनी अंडर आर्टिकल 275 टू दैट स्टेट so that it is able to fill that revenue gap. Multiple states are eligible to receive this money. States receive this money in different quantum. Under Article 275, states receive revenue filling grants by the central government from central finances. Finance Commission has recommended these grants to states which are in lieu of their revenue filling grants. So that is first, they have increased. Next, recommendation of Finance Commission is with respect to sector specific grants. They have recommended increased allocation for health. They have also recommended allocation for health for central government also. They have allocated money for disaster management for state as well as center. Important point to note, Finance Commission has recommended grants to center and state on disaster management for two purposes, and it has fixed their proportion. It has recommended grants to state for both response and mitigation. Disaster response के लिए और disaster mitigation, that is minimize करने के लिए, it has recommended those grants. For states, that is for state SDRF, and for NDRF, it has recommended those things. So these are recommendation of Finance Commission. It has also recommended money increase the devolution to local bodies. It has divided local body into two parts, urban and rural. Urban bodies have been divided further into two parts, urban bodies of million plus cities and urban bodies of non-million plus cities. सिटीज जिनकी पॉपुलेशन 1 मिलियन से ज्यादा है वर्सेस सिटीज जिनकी पॉपुलेशन 1 मिलियन से कम है, ये दो टाइप की अर्बन बॉडीज हैं, एंड अदर रूरल बॉडीज. इट हैज रिकमेंडेड फॉर बोथ टाइड एंड अनटाइड ग्रांट्स. टाइड मतलब विच आर लिंक्ड टू परफॉर्मेंस इंसेंटिव्स. Some steps that you have to take, for example, you have to take steps for cleanliness, sanitation, hygiene, provision of clean water. If you take those steps, then some money will be provided to you. Grants by Finance Commission directly to local bodies which are tied as well as untied. Earlier, Finance Commission used to give grants via state governments. Now they are recommending grants to be given directly to local bodies. Important point to note. So this is with respect to Finance Commission. Now let's have a look at debts and deficits. When we talk about government debt, जब हम सरकार के डेट की बात करते हैं, debt of the government is called as public debt. Number one. Number two, public debt is not the only liability of government. Total liabilities of government are referred to as public debt and other liabilities. Other liabilities are liabilities of government on account of your public accounts. We have various accounts: Consolidated Fund of India, Contingency Fund of India, and Public Accounts of India. Public Accounts of India में जो पैसा है, whatever liability is on that account is government's other liabilities. So I'll repeat, total liabilities of the government are two. One is public debt and second is other liabilities. Public debt refers to money that the government has borrowed, जो सरकार ने borrow किया है. Borrow मतलब government has gone to somebody and asked for that money. Money that has been borrowed by government is public debt. Government के borrow किया हुआ money public debt है, not people. People's borrowed money is not public debt. Government borrowed money is public debt. Number one. Number two, what is other liability? Other liability is liability on account of public account of India. Money which the government holds not because it has borrowed that money but as a trustee. I have got my provident fund account. In that provident fund account, I deposit money every month. My employer deposit money every month. Provident fund account. That is my money. मेरा पैसा है. I have some infrastructure bonds. That is my money. Pension fund. That is my money. Money belongs to me, but it is there with the government, and I will get that money once I retire. Let's say, or after some time. I will get that money after some time, not because I have, मैंने सरकार को पैसा उधार पे नहीं दिया है. I have not given that money. I'm sorry, government has not borrowed that money. Government did not come to me and borrow that money from me. I have given that money to government to keep it, and I will claim that money after 20, 30, 40 years when I retire, or whatever the time period is, with interest. So government has that money, which is not its money. It belongs to me, but it is held by the government as a custodian, as a trustee. This is also government's liability. सरकार को ये भी तो पैसा वापस करना है ना. So this is also government's liability. So this total public debt and other liabilities, these are the total liabilities of the government. Number one, public debt is of two types: internal debt and external debt. Internal debt is debt which is owed to resident units. Resident matlab citizens. Debt which the government owes to residents, that is internal debt. External debt is debt which the government owes to non-residents. Government has borrowed money from somebody else outside the country, that is external debt. External debt of the government की बात कर रहे हैं हम. We are not talking about external debt of the country. This is external debt as a component of public debt. This is different from external debt of the country. External debt of country से different है ये चीज. This is different. External debt of a country would mean external debt of all the residents towards non-residents. If I have borrowed money from abroad, that counts as part of external debt of the country. Versus here, I am talking only about external debt of the government. Public debt का component external debt की बात करिए यहाँ पे. If Reliance Industries borrows money from outside the country, that is part of country's external debt. India का external debt कितना है? सरकार का नहीं है वो. That is not government. That is country's external debt. Point to note. So internal debt and external debt, two components of public debt and other liabilities, as I've explained to you. These are the total liabilities of the government. When we talk about debt of the government, debt is undertaken with certain objectives in mind. When you have to borrow money, the entity that is lending money to you will assess your suitability. When you are borrowing money from someone, you will also like to see that debt is taken which is sustainable for you. You have taken a loan of 5 crore rupees for 20 years at 8% interest, and the EMI that you have to pay is, let's say, 5 lakh rupees per month. If you have to pay an EMI of 5 lakh rupees per month, then you should be earning a salary of 10-15 lakh per month. अगर आपकी सैलरी तो मान लो 6 लाख रुपए है और आपकी EMI 5 लाख रुपए जाती है, या 5.5 लाख रुपए आपकी सैलरी है और आपकी EMI 5 लाख रुपए जाती है, is it sustainable for you? You will have to incur lot of other expenses as well. So a bank will lend money to you only when it sees that you will be able to afford that EMI. Only then money will be lent to you. For government, what is income of the government? Income of government is basically taxes. How much tax is it collecting? Based on that, it will be assessed that whether the debt that the government has undertaken is sustainable or not. How much interest it is paying versus how much income it is getting. If the rate of growth of income is less than the interest that you pay, then probably you will be incurring an unsustainable amount of debt. For your debt to be sustainable, first and foremost principle is that the cost must be minimum. First objective of debt management is that you incur debt at a minimum cost. There are various parameters that you use to assess to see whether your debt is sustainable or not. The first most important parameter is that you look at debt sustainability by looking at cost of your debt. Next, you also see what is the time period of repayment. If most of the debt that you have today, you have to repay it in next 5 years. मान लेते हैं आपने जितना भी लोन ले रखा है और उसका टाइम ऑफ रीपेमेंट अगले कुछ सालों में ही पड़ रहा है, that means your EMIs would be quite high, hence your ability to spend money on other items would be less, versus if the debt that you have to repay, most of it has to be paid in future, distant future. Debt की जो maturity profile है, maturity profile of debt is such that it is some which is maturing in few years, some which is maturing in next few, some which is maturing in let's say 10 to 15 years, next some which is maturing in greater than 20 years. This debt maturity profile is more sustainable as compared to if you have let's say 50% of your debt that is maturing in next 5 years. So second element of debt sustainability is the maturity profile, as in the maturity period. What is the maturity timeline of your debt? That is, when does it have to be repaid back? Another objective while government incurs debt is development of market. Development of market means that when government borrows money, there are only a few entities which can lend money to the government. There are only a few big entities, let's say banks, insurance companies, RBI, mutual fund. Only these big entities can lend money to the government. If the entities that can lend money to the government are many, तो सरकार भी कम नाम पे पैसा उठा सकती है. देखो, गवर्नमेंट ऑलरेडी मार्केट में सबसे कम नाम पे पैसा उठाती है. Already the interest that government pays is the least interest that anybody pays in the market. Government will borrow money from me, you, anybody else at the least interest rate. Why? Because it is considered to be the safest entity in the economy. But if government gets access to large number of people who are willing to lend money to government, then even further government can reduce the amount of government can further reduce the cost of debt that it is incurring. So government also tries to develop a market for debt, development of debt market. I should get the opportunity that I can lend money to government. Government should get opportunity that government can borrow money from me. So these are various elements that we see with respect to debt sustainability and various objectives of debt management. This on your left hand side is the the interest rate of Indian government debt. If you see that largely there has been a trend of downward movement. The average rate of interest that Indian government is paying on the borrowing is somewhere around 5.5%. This is despite this. On your right hand side you see trend in government debt. सरकार का debt कितना है? Naturally, देखो, we were on a trajectory of lowering government debt. Till this point, we were on a trajectory of lowering government debt. But obviously, pandemic struck and therefore our debt increased drastically. From about 49% of debt to GDP ratio, our debt to GDP ratio increased to about 59%. लगभग 10% of GDP extra, 10% GDP was our borrowing. In the year 2019, in the year 2020-21, last financial year, in the year 2020-21, government's fiscal deficit of government was around 9.3%. That means this year government borrowed around 9.3% of GDP. Government borrowed this much amount of money from the economy. याद करो, मैं थोड़ी देर पहले देखा था, what was the total revenue of the government? Tax to GDP ratio. Tax to GDP ratio कितनी सरकार की? 9.9%. Tax to GDP ratio is 9.9%. Government is borrowing 9.3%. और कितना स्पेंड करवाना चाहते हो सरकार से? जितनी सरकार की इनकम है, this is 9.9% of GDP, that is the tax revenue of the government. जितनी सरकार की इनकम है, लगभग उतना ही सरकार ने बोरो कर रखा है. Almost that much amount is what has been borrowed by the government. Think about it, government is earning some money and it is exactly that amount that government in that particular उसी साल इतना borrow किया सरकार ने. That is causing this almost 10% rise in debt to GDP ratio of the government. Debt क्या है? Debt is accumulated deficit. So this is what is happening. This is what is happening. Now, despite an increase in government borrowing, despite a substantial increase in fiscal deficit and debt to GDP ratio of the government, despite that, interest rate cost has been decreasing, which is a good sign. If our interest rate that we are paying is less, that means debt is sustainable. Debt sustainable hai. Debt sustainable hai. Interest rate that the government is paying is less. Since it is paying a less interest rate, therefore, despite a rise in your debt, despite a rise in your fiscal deficit, lot of borrowing that you are doing, despite that, if interest rate that you pay is less, that means debt is sustainable. Economic survey says that since our debt is sustainable, therefore we have got more fiscal room. We have got more room so that we can borrow more. If need be, if need arises, we can borrow more and spend more. अगर जरूरत पड़ती है तो हम borrow कर सकते हैं. Signal that they are trying to give to the rating agencies to give proper rating to Indian government bonds. That is the signal that they are trying to give, so that rating agencies give good rating to Indian government bond. Hence, Indian government can raise money at even a lower interest rate, and general interest rate in the markets decline even further. This is first aspect of debt sustainability. Other aspects. Other aspect is this, which is the debt. The maturity profile of maturity profile of total debt. Maturity profile hai. The debt that is maturing in next 5 years is about 29%. The debt that is maturing in 20 years and above is about 19%. If you see, the green bar hai, green bar is our maturity profile in the year 2012. And this orange bar is our maturity profile in the year 2020-21. If you see these bars, then you see 20 years and above, debt that is maturing after 20 years, that debt has increased. So therefore, this is a very positive sign for the Indian economy, that your maturity profile of debt is shifting to more towards being long term. Long term debt ज़्यादा है, इसीलिए it's good for your economy. More proportion of your debt is now financed, more proportion of debt is now such that it is long term in nature. Last year सवाल पूछा गया था, उससे पिछले साल सवाल पूछा गया था. Maximum proportion of Indian government's external debt is denominated in dollars versus rupees. Question पिछले साल का prelims का सवाल है. So they have already asked a question in prelims with respect to what is the denomination of your external debt. They can now ask a question with respect to what is the maturity profile of your debt, or they can ask a question with respect to what is the interest rate of your debt. For example, there can be two statements that debt of Indian government rose sharply last year, true. Second statement would be interest that Indian government pays on debt has reduced. अगर आपको नहीं पता कि interest increase हुआ है या decrease हुआ है, probably you will answer this question by taking an intelligent guess that because debt has increased, therefore interest rates would have increased. But the answer is debt has increased, and despite an increase in debt, interest rate has decreased. So you must be careful about what you read from economic survey, what you understand from this. This is the question that ये मैंने यहाँ पे लिखा भी है question. I have discussed this question exactly. One more important information is what are the sources of financing of debt. Banks finance maximum proportion of government debt. About 37% of total government debt is financed by banks. Next is your insurance companies, which finance about 25% of government debt. Provident Fund, RBI, mutual fund, they also finance government debt. RBI being the third largest provider of government debt at about 16%. As I said, they have asked multiple questions in prelims with respect to debt. अभी कुछ साल पहले उन्होंने सवाल पूछा था that state government can issue treasury bills or not. उसके बाद सवाल पूछा विद रिस्पेक्ट टू डिनोमिनेशन ऑफ करेंसी. दे आस्क क्वेश्चन विद रिस्पेक्ट टू कॉम्पोजिशन ऑफ डेट. एक्सटर्नल डेट के क्या क्या कंपोनेंट्स है, दे हैव आस्क्ड दिस क्वेश्चन एज वेल. So please pay attention, please make sure that you get to know this. This is new information which is there in this economic survey. This information is important from prelims perspective. This is important. Sources of financing of government debt. Banks are the biggest source. Government borrows money by issuing government securities. Government prints government securities and issues them in the market. The government securities that it issues are issued for multiple maturities. Sometimes government issues security for short term maturity, that is, let's say 91 days, 364 days, 150 days. Short term government securities are referred to as commonly government securities or treasury bills. Treasury bills are unsecured. Longer term securities are commonly called as government bonds or dated securities. डेटेड सिक्योरिटी और गवर्नमेंट बॉन्ड मतलब लॉन्ग टर्म की बात करते हैं, मोर देन 1 ईयर, 5 ईयर मैच्योरिटी, 10 ईयर मैच्योरिटी, 15, 40 ईयर मैच्योरिटी, अप टू 40 ईयर मैच्योरिटी की सिक्योरिटी अवेलेबल है. द इंटरेस्ट रेट दैट गवर्नमेंट पेज ऑन दीज बॉन्ड्स इज अकॉर्डिंग टू द एग्जिस्टिंग यील्ड ऑन द एग्जिस्टिंग सिक्योरिटी. गवर्नमेंट टुडे ऑन 14th February गवर्नमेंट वांट्स टू बोरो मनी. Government wants to borrow money today by issuing a 5-year government security. In past, government would have issued some security. Let's say today the maturity of that security is 5 years. Matlab there already exists a government security in the market which is going to mature in 5 years. And today government wants to issue a new government security whose maturity period would be 5 years. The interest rate that government will issue on this new security will be equal to the yield, not interest rate, the yield on the existing security. जो existing security yield दे रही होगी उसके बराबर interest rate सरकार इस नई security के ऊपर offer करेगी. These government securities are purchased mostly by big banks. Big banks as in big investors. Banks can purchase them. RBI can purchase them. RBI is the entity that conducts these operations. So RBI can itself purchase also. Banks purchase them. Insurance companies purchase them. Mutual funds purchase them. Provident funds purchase them. Various entities which purchase them. When these entities purchase these government securities, what they do is government securities go to them, money goes to the government, that is government has borrowed this money. Now RBI has come up with a new scheme called as retail direct scheme. RBI has come up with a new scheme called as retail direct scheme. What is this retail direct scheme? Retail direct scheme is under which retail investors such as me and you, we can directly buy these government securities using RBI's platform. RBI ने एक platform build किया है and through that platform retail investors can directly purchase these government securities. Therefore RBI is trying to develop a more orderly bond market. They are trying to increase the government bond market so that retail investors can purchase them. They can purchase them directly. They can purchase them directly from the government, as in जैसे IPO में apply करते हो. When you apply in an IPO of a company, you get shares of that company directly, first hand from that company. You get those shares first hand. Government has issued a bond. You will get that bond first hand. You can buy those bonds first hand, or you can directly buy government bonds from the market as well. A share was रिलायंस इंडस्ट्री का आईपीओ आया था 91, 92 में, जब भी कभी आया उससे पहले ही आ गया था रिलायंस इंडस्ट्री का आईपीओ. बट इवन टुडे यू कैन परचेज रिलायंस इंडस्ट्री शेयर फ्रॉम द मार्केट. आई हैव गॉट लेट्स से रिलायंस इंडस्ट्री शेयर, यू कैन बाय फ्रॉम मी. So similarly, I have got government security bonds today, you can purchase from me. So you can both bid for government bonds first hand or second hand, that is primary market or secondary market. So this is what this retail direct scheme is. Very important. retail direct scheme क्या है? Objective orderly development of bond markets. What will it do? Enable retail investors to purchase government bonds directly from the government bonds directly via RBI portal. किसने लॉन्च करी है? RBI ने लॉन्च करी है स्कीम, रिटेल डायरेक्ट स्कीम. These are trends in deficits. ये deficits के trends हैं. Trends in deficits as in these are general government debt and deficit trends, and these are central government trends in deficits. Question in prelims: arrange the following deficit in the increasing or decreasing order of magnitude. Primary deficit, revenue deficit, effective revenue deficit, fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is equals to total borrowing of government. This is fiscal deficit, which is total expenditure minus non-debt receipts. Non-debt receipt matlab revenue receipts plus non-debt capital receipts. This is what your fiscal deficit is. Total expenditure minus non-debt receipt. Non-debt matlab revenue plus non-debt capital. Revenue deficit is equals to revenue receipts minus revenue expenditure, or opposite. Revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. What is effective revenue deficit? Effective revenue deficit is revenue deficit minus grants to states for creation of capital assets. This is your effective revenue deficit. What is primary deficit? This is equals to fiscal deficit minus interest payment. These are the four basic deficit that we have: fiscal, revenue, effective revenue, primary. Exam में पूछ सकते हैं, arrange the following in the increasing or decreasing order of their magnitude. One thing must be very clear, that biggest is fiscal deficit. Fiscal is the biggest, obviously, because it means what is the total amount of borrowing. How much are you borrowing in total? That is fiscal. So fiscal तो सबसे बड़ा होगा ही होगा. Next, revenue would certainly be greater than effective revenue. Revenue deficit would be greater than effective revenue. Why? Because effective revenue is revenue deficit minus something. Minus क्या कर रहे हो? Grants to states for creation of capital assets. Central government's grants to states are categorized as revenue expenditure, but since their purpose is for creation of capital assets, they are reduced to arrive at ERD. So RD ERD से बड़ा है और FD सबसे बड़ा है. तो अब प्रॉब्लम बस यही है एग्जाम में, if examiner is trying to confuse you, examiner can place primary deficit somewhere. Primary deficit यहां भी आ सकता है, यहां भी आ सकता है, यहां भी आ सकता है. Where will primary deficit be? Primary deficit is, as in fiscal deficit is biggest, number one. Revenue is bigger than effective revenue. This is also given. Where would primary be? It can be here, it can be here, it can be here. याद कर लो, primary सबसे छोटा है. Primary class सबसे छोटी class है. Primary class is the youngest class. So primary deficit is the सबसे छोटा deficit. Least amount of deficit is primary. Primary के ऊपर effective revenue के ऊपर revenue के ऊपर fiscal deficit. याद कर लिया. So this is how you can solve a question. Trends in deficits and debt. Debt to GDP ratio of general government is around 90%. Fiscal deficit of general government is about 10%. General matlab center plus state. Fiscal deficit of only central government is about 6.8%. Center का 6.8%, states का around 3%. So therefore about 9.8 or 10% for general government, that is center and states combined. So this is with respect to debts, deficits, their sustainability. We have come to the last part. Of our discussion. We're going to end in about 5 minutes. The last part of the chapter second, that is fiscal developments, talks about improvement in expenditure rationalization and improvement in revenue mobilization. How can we improve our expenditure, that is reduce expense plus whatever expense is there, increase its efficiency. देखो expenditure in your GS paper 2 there is a special topic given. GS paper 2 का syllabus देखना, उसमें एक topic लिखा है performance of government schemes, how to improve those government schemes. This is what is being talked about here. Improvement of government expenditure. When we say we have to improve government expenditure, there are multiple aspects associated with it. Number one, improving the quality of expense. Quality means less revenue, more capital. Reduce your revenue expense and increase your capital outlay. Quality of expense. Second, quality के बाद reduction of expenditure. Reduce where you can. Third, improve the efficiency of expenditure. That is, whatever expense you are incurring, try to make sure that in that expense you get the best. Improve quality, reduce expense wherever you can, and in areas where you are incurring expense, improve the efficiency of expenditure. That is what is your expenditure rationalization. Amongst many steps that the government has taken, जैसे one is government has increased capital expenditure. Government got the opportunity in form of COVID and government increased capital expense by borrowing or by whatever means. Government has increased capital expense, so kudos to that. Second, government has also improved the efficiency of expenditure as has been explained through use of GEM portal. GEM क्या है? Government e-marketplace. Through this GEM portal, government has tried to improve the efficiency of its expense. GEM portal. Government has tried to move away from focus solely on least cost expense to quality of expense as well, again improving the efficiency part. So these are some of the reforms with respect to efficiency. With respect to revenue side of the government, there is an annex that is given, annex 1 and 2. You can refer to that. I have briefly mentioned steps that the government has taken. Faceless assessment, faceless compliance, faceless appeals, improve in tax administration, increase in compliance, reducing the cost of compliance, ease out process of GST, registrations, compliances, filing of returns with respect to income tax, easing up of all these tax compliance norms. The government has taken many steps with respect to this. So all these are part of government's efforts with respect to rationalization of revenue. So this is with respect to fiscal developments. With this we'll end the today's session. I think I said that I'll try to wrap up the session within 2 hours, but it has been far beyond 2 hours. Anyways, I tried to be as brief as possible, but sometimes it does get extended. Still, it's not 3 hours, the allotted time usse to kam hi hai. Anyways, we'll meet tomorrow again, and tomorrow we'll discuss 2 chapters of prices and inflation and bank and monetary policy and banking. So tomorrow we'll discuss these 2 topics. Till then, take care everybody. Goodbye. See you soon next time. Bye bye.